Thanks, Jenna. Just want to welcome everybody and do a quick review of our agenda for today. Hopefully you received both the kind of general agenda, and then hot off the press a few days ago, we were able to send out a deliberative agenda that has kind of the substantive topics for the day. I believe that's also been posted on the WRD's page devoted to this project. So for those of you that are out in the public sphere and want to follow along, disclaimer that we're sort of following the work group needs. So some of those topics and order of the topics are subject to change. So I hope everybody can practice a little flexibility with that regard. We will be here until 3. We'll take a break at 1 o'clock. We will offer an opportunity for public comment toward the end of the meeting. And so if you are interested in providing public comment today, you can send a quick private chat over to Jenna Stillman, my colleague, and let her know that you'd like to do public comment. It's helpful for us to get folks in the queue, just get a sense of how many people might be interested. And we'll check in on that again later this afternoon. So with that, I'll just say a few words about today. We did hear some feedback in between meetings that we want to hear both from folks we want to hear from everybody on the work group. So we've really been, because we're kind of working toward where do we have agreements and consensus on these different substantive ideas, we've been trying to kind of devote time to folks who have serious concerns. And so we have heard that, and we've also want to bring in voice to those who are compelled around any particular recommendations that you particularly like or want the group to know that you're really supportive of. So we just want to make room for all of that conversation in this space to the best of our ability. And really, I think the other principle behind that is just no surprises. So maybe you've been hanging back and not really weighing in, but we do need to hear from you, all of you. And particularly if there's something that you want to offer to the group that's different than where kind of direction that any of these ideas are going. We just don't want surprises at the end. That's a big principle I think we should be mindful of as we're really we're edging closer and closer to the finish line on this work. So today, and then the other thing I wanted to offer is, questions around how we incorporate friendly amendments to the ideas or opportunities to provide additional detail for consideration. We'd like to get all of the conversations that are happening in the meeting are part of that. And just to tee up that version 3 of the straw proposal that WRD has been continuing to update and send out, which will be distributed after this meeting. We'll consider, consideration of September, October meeting discussions, written feedback via the worksheets from version 2. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the day. For today, the focus is on kind of 3 or 4 primary topics. One is a revised qualifying for place-based planning proposal based on where we left off at the last meeting. Specific recommendations related to clarifying the role and requirement of the state in place-based planning. Community engagement guide and recommendations. We had just a couple of little loose ends there that I think have gotten resolved, at least in the small group. So we'll have an opportunity for the community engagement task group to bring that forward. And then we'll look at potential introductory language for your report. We're going to move the big topic of recognition of a plan and implementation ideas to November 1st meeting. Partly that's because we recognize that the group needs more information about what came of the place-based planning effort, what came out of any of the resulting evaluation or lessons learned from that. and then go into a discussion about what could be. And the department, Water Resources Department, will be prepared to share information about all of this next time. And so we'll make more room for that discussion at the next meeting, just to give it time. And also so we can kind of continue to deal with the issues that have been at play in these other sections. So that's where we're headed for today. Like I said, we will take a break at 1 o'clock. Oops. Oh. And we'll have you out of here by 3 o'clock. And we'll talk at the end again about what the next steps are between now and your November 1st meeting. But we'll kind of skip those logistics for now. So Peggy, it sounded like you had a question about something.
I just have one comment, since I can't be here for the second half of the meeting. We've worked really hard to get a report on how we do place-based planning in the future. I just want to make sure that the draft report not only focuses on that recommendation, but underneath it, the funding and for agencies and the staffing needs for agencies to support whatever planning effort we decide to support, and implementation of that work. And to me, that's probably the heart of what I see as the report, versus getting all the details about exactly how the place-based planning effort is going to happen. So I just want to put that on the table. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Peggy. Kimberly.
Yeah, I guess I just want to flag a process concern, or maybe it's a request. I know, we're all getting a lot of documents, and I'm becoming a little concerned that we're being asked to make consensus votes on specific issues somewhat in a vacuum. It seems to me that like we have conversations, there's sort of, a general movement towards some either resolution or consensus. And then we get another deliberative item in front of us that either isn't tracking the decisions made or is incorporating pieces of outstanding topics that we haven't talked about yet. And so I guess I'm just a little concerned on how this is all going to be woven together, and whether, are you guys going to consolidate things? How can we make decisions on certain items when they're tied so closely either to things we've already decided or haven't decided? I feel like I'm not being very linear, sorry, but I guess I just trying to see the path forward with all these many deliberatives in front of us.
Yeah, Lily, do you want to speak to where version 3 of the straw is headed? And I can talk a little bit about then the process for migrating the substantive issues over to the group's report.
Yeah, so I think in version 3, we're going to try to streamline and consolidate the recommendations. And so you're not being asked to when we originally drafted the recommendations, it was pretty specific. Each recommendation is talking about a different thing, but in version 3, we're hoping to acknowledge the interconnectedness a little bit more. And so when you're being asked to vote on your consensus check for that one, I think it'll be hopefully a little bit more clear and a little bit more connected than it currently is.
And then for the topics today, Kimberly, I'm happy to speak to where things left off from our last conversation and how they relate to the topics for today. And if that's still not clear, let me know or let the group know. Okay, April.
Thank you. And I do see that on our agenda, as opposed to the deliberative agenda, we've got it's talking about follow-up from the last meeting, and so I won't dive into that, but I do want to echo and affirm the comments made by Kimberly. It is something that I also have concerns about, and kind of Robin, you asked for no surprises. And so I think while I feel I've been very actively engaged in this process and have tried to leave space for making sure other folks that we haven't heard from as much also feel that they're able to provide voices, and I still encourage that. But for me, and this applies to any number of activities, I need to see the idea in the context in the document. I need to see the full document, see how that's going to fit together. It's both process concerns, as Kimberly brought up, where we've talked about different things, raised concerns, offered suggestions, and it's not really clear where those are or how those are being incorporated, or where there's disagreement, how that's being addressed. And so for me, if we don't see something that is in its entirety, and I really appreciate that we have Lily and that she's doing her best to put all these things together, but it makes it more likely that what comes out is not going to be something I'm going to be able to be supportive of, because, you know, maybe there's some really great ideas in there, but the way that it's packaged together is problematic, or any number of reasons. And so I think particularly as we go through these remaining meetings we have, and I will flag, I have a standing commitment that will prevent me from participating in the next meeting, but we need to be really clear on what it is that we're being asked to provide feedback on, whether we're saying thumbs up and that's the way it's going, or, you know, is it just conceptual, kind of some of those different differentiations. I will also mention, and this was part of why I didn't put my camera on at the beginning, it's a little challenging. I have a lot on my plate. I think all of us do, but the documents are all in all different places. They're not even in the same email. They're not all on the web page. And so that's been a bit of a struggle for me as a work group member, to feel that I'm able to put my fingers on the different documents and provide the feedback as much as possible. But I don't mean to be overly critical. I know we've got a lot of work to do, and we've done quite a lot at this point, but I think it's going to be really important at this point that we're being exceptionally clear on what it is we're asked for feedback on, how that's being used, and if we're not in agreement, that goes in a separate pile, so that we can focus on the things that we do have agreement on, or are able to most focus in on, that are most important to ensuring that the work and time we put into this process yields something that is helpful moving forward.
Thank you, April. Kaylin and Raquel.
Thanks. Kaylin Barter, Wild Salmon Center. I'm gonna go ahead and me too to everything that Peggy, Kimberly, and April have said, including the part about having the longstanding commitment that prevents me from being able to join the next meeting. This has been in some of my, written feedback that I've provided about needing to be able to see these proposals in context, and also understanding how these proposals will be framed, whether they're recommendations, whether they're presented as consensus recommendations, whether they're intended to be more along the lines of pointing to other documents that have already been prepared. And also needing to be very clear about how we got to this narrowed focus on the next generation of place-based planning. So renewing my support for the previous comments, and as you all can expect, going to put in my meeting plug for all of us have continued to identify expanding the state's data access and technical assistance to underpin all of this work. So again, if that's the single recommendation that comes out of this work group, then I still see that as a win. Thanks.
Thank you. Raquel and Kristen.
Good morning, everyone. So I think based on what I'm hearing, Lily, I think her and I can chat about the website, because I agree that we should get, unless there's a reason not to, Robin or Lily, I think we should get all of the documents in one place up on the website. And I think that's something that we can do to make things easier on folks. I also get a lot of emails, so I feel your pain on that front and trying to find things. The other piece, I guess I'd ask maybe Robin or Lily if you think is helpful, is just based on what I'm hearing from, I don't think it was you, Kaylin, whoever spoke before you. Sorry, I've already forgotten the list here, but I don't know if it would be helpful if there's, if we're taking a vote on an item, or at least showing some to give a general sense of whether there's potentially consensus, but folks have say, yes, this is fine as long as X applies, so some other recommendation applies. I wonder, Robin, is there an easy way? I know you don't want to use the chat, but for someone to be able to communicate, I'm good as long as this other thing is tied to it. And maybe that's already a given the I want to say 5-finger system, but I'm not sure that we're using fingers here. Given the system where you have like, I've got some concerns, but I'm not 100% on board. So maybe that's already built in. But maybe that's some way for folks to at least be able to say, I'm good, but here's what I need in order to actually be fully on board with it. But maybe that's just us figuring that out through the process and not something we can deal with today.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is that the direction that Lily was going with the version 3 of this document really is intended to kind of consolidate and package all of the different ideas that have come through this process in terms of where we've actually done early gut consensus or not checks. And so it's kind of fitting into the same categories that she's got identified in the sections of the straw. And so like there's a data one that you all dealt with a few meetings ago that will show up in version 3 where you landed, where we had an agreement. But we also want to make sure that people at the end of the day have an opportunity to see that all connected, so that while early on you might have agreed with something, we want to give you an opportunity as a whole to say, I'm good with this, these things need to be linked or not. So that's where we're headed right after today's meeting. I think we're trying to use the meeting space to go through all the deliberative topics. But we hear you loud and clear that needing to see this kind of formatted in a way that shows kind of the comprehensive view of all of the items that we're assuming have been deliberated on, and some early alignment checks have been done on these things, and to show where there's agreement and not agreement. So that's the intention right on the heels of today's meeting, is to get that kind of consolidated document going. Kristen?
Great, thank you.
Oh,
Robin, I would just draw really quickly. It looks like Lily is already on it because Jenna just put in the chat that all of the materials, it looks like, are already online and in one place. Is that correct? And so, nope, I'm seeing those from Kaylin. Okay.
They're online, but they're not complete. And I'm just going to raise again that this particular drop down status of trying to be able to track where documents are by meeting is so difficult to navigate. Forcing, I guess, this work group's process through the department's existing drop down menu framework for board and commission meetings is just really counterintuitive, I think. I mean, if there's any opportunity for us to actually be able to have a centralized repository that's publicly accessible for all of the documents that we've been working on, producing, deliberating on over the course of this work group, that would be such a win. I am really concerned about the public's ability to be able to engage on this. And that's a commitment that we all made at the beginning of this. So if there's an opportunity to remedy that in some way, what's there right now is just a subset of what our materials that were emailed to us were provided in advance of this meeting.
all right. So we'll ask the department folks to do a review of that and figure out at least at a minimum how to get all the documents uploaded. And even better if they get organized in a way that makes it much more accessible for people. Kristen?
I will just say, what am I, a me 5, I guess, to this conversation, sharing concerns. I won't reiterate those. The other piece, though, that I think you're touching on, but as I'm looking, and shame on me for missing one of the meetings, but when I'm looking at how these deliberative agendas have progressed, I'm still back in the not understanding where some of the materials that we had conversations on earlier in the process and then have kind of vanished. And so if that list of the materials that comes through had any sort of annotation that was, Oregon consensus believes the group agreed we're not going to do this, or we believe the consensus on this conversation was to go in this direction, and that's why this framework is no longer under consideration. I'm just having trouble tracking some of the early things to where we are now and the evolution of the process, especially around issues that I felt like we deliberated but didn't necessarily reach a clear consensus on, and then they're just kind of gone from the process. So if there's a little bit of like a tracking, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think, Kristen, I mean, at a minimum, it's through the summary notes, but I'm curious if there are specific issues that you can help us understand what got dropped from your perspective.
I will go through and detail those in a follow-up email. I feel like that could be a long, extended, circuitous conversation to take everyone's time on right now. But I would be happy to highlight some of those things that I'm like, I don't really feel like we closed a loop on that, and now we're over here. So is this still in play, or are we just not doing that now?
Yeah, great. Okay, appreciate it. Oriana?
Yeah, I just want to go back to what Kaylin said about like making this accessible to the public and that commitment we made. I think the issues that Kaylin and Kristen both raised are not important only for us as work group members. And I think I'm in agreement as a work group member with much of what's been said so far, but just thinking from the perspective of someone who is tracking this process, I think it could feel very confusing why we're making decisions that we're making, and how to potentially influence those decisions. We haven't had a lot of uptake of public comment, but I wonder how much of that has to do with just some of the confusion about like what to comment on. So perhaps a request, kind of putting my community engagement hat on, would be one, to just be clear about like when documents are posted, like what's a decision-making document, or what's something, not just what is a deliberative agenda, which may not be clear to some folks, but just clearly like this is a document that you should review because the group is going to make a decision on it. And if you want to give public comment, like this is the kind of space that people may want to hear from you on. And then similarly to Kristen, I think a tracking document could be really helpful. And I want to be conscious of the labor that might go into kind of both of these things, and just recognize that capacity is limited for WRD and for Oregon Consensus right now. But I think it would be helpful to just understand like the path of certain issues, or like how we ended up with like the document that we have now, and what kind of led into it, like what previous conversations or what previous documents. And I think that would be helpful for folks tracking the process to just understand not only like what can you give public comment on that can help inform decision making, but also understanding what how we've gotten to this point, which I think is an important piece for someone trying to track this process.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess one question I have for the department, having not looked on your site at what's uploaded and what's not, are you putting the kind of version 1 to 2 to 3 changes and track changes up on the website? Because the substantive evolution of these topics would show up through both the Lily's work on showing the red line versions of version 1 to 2 to 3, but also she did a whole crosswalk of like every single comment that was submitted by work group members on the different pieces to show that she's trying to show that through line that way. So I wonder, Lily, if those are up there for folks to see. And not that that's the best way to do it, but those are the documents that do track along from one version to the next. We can try to figure out if there's an easier way for you all to see that. But I just want to acknowledge that I feel like WRD has been trying to do that via those track changes and showing every single comment that folks have submitted on these different substantive topics.
Robin, comments have not been posted. I'd be happy to put those up there. Currently, it's agenda, meeting minutes, and then the V1 is up there, the V2 is up there. Any sort of like deliberative document that we go through in the meeting is up there. But I'd be happy to throw some of that background material up there as well.
Thanks. Kelly.
I'm assuming that one thing that Kaylin and also Kristen and other folks were getting at too, it's just it's nice to have all of it there, but yeah, just perhaps the arrangement of, because I've gone through this before with other organizations as well. It's like, you don't know what happens in any of the meetings. So you literally have to like click through all of the meetings to find what you're looking for. So I don't know if they're, can do that with the website, but having, maybe where it's like summaries, versions, like where it's more grouped by like, so you can understand what the documents are going to be in there. I mean, if you could literally pull in and watch all the versions come together, 1, 2, 3, all stacked versus looking through them, that would be helpful. But just a suggestion, Lily and Robin. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we'll take all this in, and I'll spend a little time with the department at the break just to kind of get our heads together on if there's any kind of quick acting pivots that we can make for them on the website and for us on streamlining and consolidating all of the recommendations into the comprehensive. So it's really clear kind of all of the pieces together. Like I said, that was the intention with moving into the next version of the document that'll be distributed in a couple days after today's conversations. And then if there's other ways that we can try to make this the through line, as you're suggesting, easier for you all and the public to follow, we'll talk through that. And if folks have suggestions around or concerns around certain substantive items that you are concerned got dropped somewhere along the way that you feel are important, we absolutely want to hear that too. It's kind of your process to track as much as it is ours. And so if we're dropping things off, that's concerning, and we need to hear from you. So I appreciate, Kristen, your willingness to, from your perspective at least, kind of grab those things and let us know. So with all of that, are you all ready to move into the substantive topics for today? All right, I got one thumbs up. Thank you, Peggy. All right, so let's pull up the first item, which is this idea of qualifying for place-based planning funding. Where we left off this was related to recommendation A in the straw under the pathways and process section. Where we left off at the last meeting was that we did a quick gut check on the recommendation. There was a revision that was talked through at the meeting, and we didn't reach consensus or early consensus on that. We got some 5s in there. There was a lot of discussion, and it kind of concluded in a question around where do you have alignment on this topic? And our reflection of that is that there was general agreement that yes, there should be established criteria for accessing place-based planning funds, and that there was a general sense of that having a tiered level or different entry points for kind of meeting groups at different levels of readiness or need was generally agreed to, but there wasn't really a proposal on the table around that. So there's a small group of folks that actually worked on this, and it's what you see in your deliberative agenda. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan who has kind of been leading a little bit this conversation, and it was an idea that you brought forward last time. So I'm gonna just pause and let you kind of talk through this with the group.
Okay, first, we should probably, because this addresses some of the issues, make sure we're all talking about the same document, which I was just in the middle of pulling up here. And that was, I believe, on the October 17th email, right? The updated, see, same problem here, hopping around. Here we have, we get so many emails, it's sort of mind-boggling. I just had it too. No, I can't find it. But
Maybe we could pop open the deliberative agenda for today, because I think
Yeah.
that's where you'll find it.
right, and that's what I'm looking for. That was sent on the 17th, right? The email.
Yeah, you can grab it from the chat if that's easier. Jenna just put it in the chat.
Okay. Anyway, that pretty much sets forth what we had in our discussion. It's, I mean, the big takeaway on the thing, I don't think it's quite so much qualifying or how you qualify for funding. I think it's more for like what you qualify for or could qualify for. And that kind of incorporates that notion of having a menu, sort of a range of options rather than like a totally all in, all out. Again, the tiered approach, which isn't specifically mentioned in that document, but it's functionally, that's what happens when you look at the language there. In other words, it says a group, you know, reflecting the fact that you have a lot of different capacity and in various levels of need in the different places, whether that's a specific basin, a sub-basin, whatever it happens to be. So it just is trying to incorporate the concept that there could be tiered grants where there'd be smaller grants that would be easier to get to be able to put people in a place to put together some kind of a group that could qualify and be, you know, effective at doing a basin plan or a sub-basin plan or whatever it turns out to be the important thing to do. And then that kind of goes up the scale there, where you could then, you know, you might be ready to just jump right in and do a full, you know, full on planning thing, and you could apply for that. And the part that was sort of new, I mean, looking at how the discussion came in on this is that the notion of having an implementation coordination grant, which is that third bullet point there, which I think is really kind of an interesting way to do it, because I think as a practical matter, I know this discussion's come up. Nobody can guarantee that, you know, if you have a recognized place-based plan, et cetera, that you are going to get funding for the projects that are identified, at least through, you know, any particular identified pot of money that the state might have, because it just really doesn't work like that. And especially if you're crossing biennia, you don't know what money is going to be out there. And also the fact that, I mean, a lot of pots of funding come from different places. Some might be the state, some might be federal programs, some might be pass-through programs from federal programs through the state. But I like this point saying, I mean, that is sort of a carrot that's out there. If you go through this process, it will include some sort of grants and assistance to work towards implementing, you know, the plans and the projects and things. So again, you have that kind of phased, and then the last bullet point is likewise is recognizing that these are going to be living, should be, and probably will be living documents, partly because of the time it takes to get funding for some of these things, and also because circumstances can change. So that fourth bullet point sort of reflects the fact that there could also be grants for updating, you know, after whatever period of time that's relevant to keep these, to keep the plan alive and not have it just kind of fade into nothingness, which I think is kind of what happened with a lot of the old basin plans where they were good, and then X number of years goes by, situations change, and then pretty soon they're just on the shelf, and there was a lot of work that was kind of wasted. So I think that's more or less it. And I'm, again, to what extent that becomes, I mean, how detailed this becomes as a recommendation, or that would be actually implemented by legislation, is a different question. But I think the notion that there should be tiered levels of funding to accommodate different groups or potential groups who would be in different levels of readiness. And otherwise, I would add, I'm not sure who else is on the phone who was in that discussion, but please feel free to weigh in.
Yeah, Dan, unfortunately, the rest of the group, those
yeah.
folks aren't on the call today.
Oh, okay.
So Jeff and Bobby Bruno were on that call, and I believe Daniel Newberry weighed in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything inconsistent in this text from what we pretty much agreed to. It is stated slightly differently than we were talking about, and as I said, I think it added some stuff that's good. That's just speaking from my own perspective in terms of, like, again, that implementation coordination grant element, just kind of fleshing out a little bit. Again, whether that needs to be that specific now, or whether this just becomes assistance. Let's say we do get, a legislative proposal that basically dedicates enough funding to create this kind of assistance. It'll be useful, I think, in whatever rulemaking, whatever it would take to actually implement that. Another element which sort of gets referred to there too is sort of the realization that it's, and I think the word is used, competitive. It's a competitive grant process, which, that word sometimes has a little connotation that, you might be leaving somebody out. And I don't know if there's a better word for that, but it's true. I mean, there's probably not going to be enough funding that if every potential place-based planning group popped up and wanted money to do what they needed to do, particularly if it involved that level of getting data and getting, some of the studies and some of the on-the-ground work that you might need to get there, that can add up pretty quickly, and that's probably not going to be enough money to do it all at once. So I think that's the other kind of one of the other key concepts that I think is reflected in that, but just calling that out a little bit, that there is a competitive notion, and that somehow whoever it is that's making this determination as to which funding goes to whom, it is going to be, you're going to have to meet some kind of criteria and show that you are deserving of a grant for one of those particular categories. Again, realizing it's tiered, and obviously the lower on the ladder, in just terms of just doing an initial survey to get people's capacity up to be able to even look into it, is going to be a lot different than the folks who are looking for significant funding to really do, hydrogeologic studies of the basin and full-on water budget kind of stuff. So that's it. Nothing really jumped out in that. I mean, I think it's that document is consistent with what we were talking about. There might be some wordsmithing. I wouldn't get too carried away with that, though.
Okay. Peggy and Kimberly.
Oh, thanks, Dan. I just want to add my support to the concept of some small capacity grants. It's something that I suggested early on and asked about, and I'm thrilled. So thank you.
Great.
Kimberly?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna like flag my confusion. I think this is a really great example of how I think different things mean different things to different people. But I guess I thought we left the conversation last time on A, with what you said at the beginning, Robin, which is establishing criteria for assessing place-based planning, and then also different tiered levels, which I think is what more Dan was talking about. But I guess, you know, if you look at sort of the action item on page 8 of the meeting summary from 10.4, I guess I'm just flagging that I'm very confused with this concept as compared to what was an action item. So I feel like there's two different discussions that have to happen. Happy to have this discussion around this concept, but I think that's different than what we flagged as the action. So just because I don't want to lose that, I don't want to lose the great discussion we had last time about sort of like, how do you qualify for place-based funding? And I think the department was tasked with drafting those. So anyway, it's just, I just want to flag that it's similar to earlier conversations. It's sort of confusing what we're doing here. But as to the substance, and again, this relates back to my earlier comments, which is, you know, last time we finished off, if you looked at the last agenda, we didn't get through recognition of a plan and implementation, nor checks and balances around supporting implementation. We didn't have time to have that discussion. And so we as a group have not had a discussion about implementation, but then this idea has the word implementation throughout. And so for me, it's hard to understand how to respond when we haven't had the discussion yet on implementation. And so Dan, I'm not going to really sort of the substance of your proposal. It's more the sequencing of the conversation, because we as a group have not talked about what we think implementation should encompass, but then there is a proposal in front of us to fund implementation and to direct agency action towards implementation. So again, I feel like I'm not prepared to react to this proposal in whole until we have the discussions that are connected to the words in the proposal. And then I also just want to stress that I don't want to lose the point that we spent so much time on last time about criteria for being chosen to do a place-based plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different things there. One, on implementation, that it's a confusing, I think people are using it differently, the word implementation on different things. I don't know, some people seem to think we're implementing an actual project. You know, if there is a specific project versus just implementing a plan. So I don't know if we want to clarify that. Again, this particular language is not our language that we came up with. This was worked after the meeting and put in the format of, you know, the other documents. So it's kind of hard to respond to that specifically, but I agree that we want to kind of clarify what that means. In terms of the criteria, my initial thinking is it's going to be awfully hard for us to come up with really meaningful recommendations as to what the criteria should be, but it's certainly going to be driven by it sort of gets incorporated in some of the language here. If it's one of these basically small grant or planning capacity kind of grant things where, you know, it's saying, you know, find out who's involved, who should be there, you know, all that. I mean, presumably the effective criteria for deciding whether that kind of grant should be given was going to depend on, you know, what material is submitted that shows, you know, some preliminary amount of information that there's just willingness to to get people together, but you need to identify more. You know, first, I mean, you go up the level, what those criteria are going to be is going to be quite, you know, quite different. A full on grant to implement effective place-based planning that involves, you know, studies and analysis and all that kind of stuff is going to be a much higher level of you know, higher fence to jump over, you know, to be able to get that kind of funding. But it's not, you know, it's not radically different from what's been done for, you know, lots of grant programs, not just water related stuff, but, you know, in terms of, you know, how do you qualify for, you know, a lot of grants. And again, I don't know what our mission is, or, you know, our task is here in terms of being how specific to get on those kind of criteria, or just kind of saying, you know, there should be criteria, you know, and what the, you know, because it's competitive, because there won't be enough money in, and, you know, personally, I would leave that to kind of a more specific kind of discussion and a rulemaking type thing, where you're setting up, you know, particular how, you know, first of all, assume you've got the money to do this stuff, and then determine how it should best be distributed. And I don't know how much we want to get into that or not, but that's just me.
So I see you, Daniel. I just want to clarify, Kimberly, were you hoping that the department was going to put some draft forward of what the criteria should be?
So again, I'll just read what the action was. OWRD will draft a recommendation given this direction, the latest version, blah, blah, blah. The latest version posted for discussion in the meeting was the state should establish criteria to prioritize which basins qualify for place-based planning fund. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't read this whole thing, but I guess I feel like this is a good discussion, but that's a different discussion, different direction than we left off with last time, is where I am confused. So I just don't want to lose that piece, because that was important to some stakeholders, the prioritization.
Yeah,
and it says, yeah,
again, are
it's
you
on
hoping,
the bottom of, oh.
Yeah, are you hoping the group will talk about what those criteria should be, or are you hoping that there's a strong recommendation?
No, I just,
around.
so the action, no, that we had a very good conversation, I think, last time, with lots of good input. And then there was an action item directed at the department. And I think the timeline was for the next meeting, actually. So it's not that I want to have further discussion. I just am confused, because the way this is being presented is that this is that recommendation, not this is something different from that recommendation. So I just want to clarify that this is not instead of the work the department was going to do, because I think the state,
I think the part that Dan is talking about is the second part of it, which is the tiered. They took that and said, well, how would we maybe think about the tiered approach? And that sounds like what Dan and the group had talked about more so than what the criteria should be. So I'm just going to flag that there's an interest in having that discussion of the criteria. Is that fair enough, Kimberly? That's what you're hoping to see something from the department on?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see, it said the state should prioritize investment of these funds based on, including but not limited to, the level of need and opportunity for success using the space planning approach, and using a tiered approach to allow flexibility. So again, this just goes back to my earlier comment that, like, we're having discussions, we make decisions, they morph over time. It's just very confusing. So yes, at the very least, we would like to see the department's proposal on prioritization.
Okay, Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Dan and the rest of the group for putting this together. I wanted to say I like this approach, and I think it gets at some of the issues we've talked about barriers to entry. You know, different groups are going to have different capacities, and it's not really fair to ask all groups to spend oodles and oodles of time putting together a big proposal, when they don't have the capacity. So this idea that you're going to have the tiered structure where you can apply for a grant to do some planning so that you can really plan a good, solid proposal for implementation, I think is a good way to go. I think OWEB has had really good success with this approach with their focused investment partnerships. I have been part of that program and found it was really, really important. If you're going to put together something that's big and significant, having some capacity to do that, I think that gets to some equity concerns as well. And I would encourage the department as they go forward to continue to think about barriers to entry and equity as part of the grant process. So thanks.
And I see you, Raquel. And I wouldn't want to invite others into this conversation that we're talking about this last time. I know, Oriana, you had some conversation in this about that very issue Daniel was talking about, of kind of having different points of access and trying to overcome some of the potential barriers for communities that might not be at a state of, hey, we've got a full-on collaborative ready to go, but might still be a need area. So I'd welcome other folks into this discussion as well. Raquel?
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I was just going to follow up on Kimberly's request around criteria and what the department is doing on that front. We are preparing materials. I think the question was, what was the criteria used on the place-based planning pilots? And so we are going to be putting forward information on what was used previously. That is not to suggest that this group should or should not tackle the criteria piece, but more that there was that question that came up, and we are preparing that information, which will be discussed at the next meeting, or at least shared at the next meeting.
So Dan, do you want to talk about any of the other sections of this?
Just might say, regarding the specific issues we were just talking about, I do like the way the department, and this is at the bottom of page 1 of the deliberative agenda, that last bullet point, just as an example for the small capacity grants, to help groups, especially those in underserved areas, prepare and assess their readiness to engage in the place-based planning process. At a minimum, include scoping and convening of a group to, assess their needs and capacity and identify program design and costs of things like critical data facilitation and program administration. I mean, that almost sort of incorporates a certain kind, I guess there's kind of built-in criteria there to some degree, where, if you had a group who was in that, you had some folks who were interested in the process, but really weren't sure what was going to be involved and how to get there, that this small capacity grant could fulfill that function. And I thought that was pretty well stated. And then it kind of just falls up, goes up the ladder to actual full-on planning groups to develop a plan and achieve state recognition. I mean, that's obviously the bigger thing. And then after that is that new category, the implementation coordination grant, which is to kind of have somebody to work with them as they try to actually implement, specific items and projects and things like that the plan discloses. Which again, this could be a long period of time to in between those stages, depending upon what the data situation is there. So I just sort of like the way that that worked, and again then leading with that final one in terms of updating as you're going down the road. So and then we've got the state role.
Oh, that's
Yeah, it's a different thing.
different.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we're we're good. And then again, the basic, those first, the 1, 2, 3 under the first bullet points, seems to get fairly specific in terms of, those items that, one needs to, to address to be able to keep this process going, again, particularly in areas that haven't had a lot of experience doing this kind of work. And I thought it was, nothing in there jumped out to me as being inconsistent with what we were talking about in terms of having these tiered grants, and all seem to be pretty well done. So that's it, really.
All right, looks like Kristen and Peggy.
Yeah, so I'll start with, I share some of Kimberly's concerns about implementation and state recognition that show up in the language, just because we haven't talked about those as a group yet. But with the other parts of the document, in that first bullet under recommendation J, so the very last section on page 1, that was the first time I'd seen introduction of scoping as part of it, and maybe that showed up elsewhere in this process. But building that component of it out might be a really helpful direction to go. I've expressed some concerns that I think place-based planning is a tool, but not the only tool for doing water planning as a state. And for some of the issues that we're facing, it may not at all be the preferred tool to get to a good outcome. But taking that time to scope could help identify which of the issues and which of the concerns are really appropriate for undertaking a place-based planning process. And this is very clearly what this group is going to work towards doing. And then you're investing money in the appropriate data needs, state agency support, all of those things for the scope of what's happening. But then it leaves some space for consideration of other components of the water issues in that basin, and recognizing those are in fact outside of the scope. And I guess I'll just more transparently hit one of the concerns that I've seen is we have some sort of a water crisis in an area. There's some sort of a planning exercise going on. And so everyone's like, oh, we can't deal with that hard thing because there's this group of people doing some sort of plan over here. So we'll just wait. And I think really clarifying this is what that group's doing and what they're charged with solving with that level of clarity can then prevent some of the delays that we see sometimes at addressing some of the larger overarching issues that may be there. And so I just like the introduction of the word scoping there, and I would recommend building that out with another level of clarity for kind of this first tier effort that happens.
I always learn things at this meeting every time. Thank you, Kristen. That was really helpful. And I totally agree. I just want to go back to the concern about the word implementation. And because it was very early on in our meetings, and I don't know where it is in the minutes, but I thought we had sort of all agreed that the word implementation meant a variety of actions. It didn't necessarily mean a project. It didn't necessarily mean it could mean any kind of thing that comes out of the plan. And I want to make sure that where that definition of implementation isn't lost, because again, this was a concern that I had, that it can't just be about projects. It can be about all kinds of things that we might want to do as a planning effort to address the water problem. So thank you.
Kimberly?
Yeah, just on that point, Peggy, so this is, I think I'm not doing a good job today, but that is what I was trying to point out is, so if you look at our agenda from last time, which was for the October 4th and October 20th, not the agenda for this time, we were supposed to talk about implementation and all the different definitions or pieces that could fall under implementation. We have not had that discussion yet. That has been moved, I think, to November. And so I think that's where my confusion is, or not my confusion, but like I am gonna have a hard time voting on something until we have the discussion about what implementation is. And I agree with you, we did have sort of broad conversations earlier, but we never sort of synthesized it. So Dan, I hope that makes sense to you. It's not like the concept, it's more that there are things embedded in the concept that we haven't yet talked about. So
Yeah, until
we talk about those, then it makes me a little uncomfortable to vote.
So the details, especially around the implementation pieces, you're not ready to go there yet. Can we just? Yeah, so I would like to just, because there's 3 parts to this, and just so we're having kind of an intentional discussion about each of these pieces, really wanting to gauge across the collective of this work group, conceptually, are there some agreements and alignments? Potentially details, not so much. It sounds like there are actually some specific details in here that at least some people are not comfortable even weighing in on yet until we actually have that deeper discussion around what does it mean to recognize a plan implementation, and perhaps even reviewing some of the criteria for qualifying that the department was going to talk about next time. So setting that piece, just acknowledging that part of it, can we kind of go through this and look sort of conceptually, engage with the group? Are you aligned on this idea of there being a tiered approach to the grants? Are you aligned on some of these other pieces? There's 2 other pieces in this kind of qualifying, I guess, section. And I'm just going to pull up the document again so we can just walk through it. And then welcome Lily and Raquel to weigh in if there's anything kind of substantively that you think would be helpful to fill in with regards to this conversation of sort of the thinking behind it. Sorry, I need to pull up the document. There it is. All right. So the first part of this, so we did spend a lot of time talking about this 3rd piece, but the first part of this is starting with, the legislature should fund WRD regional or basin outreach and engagement staff throughout the state to help facilitate and guide groups through the place-based planning process. This is sort of allowing an opportunity for staff to provide some consultation to groups that might be interested. This is kind of an entry point, and doing some of the things that would help you build toward a full kind of collaborative partnership effort around place-based. So doing some consultation up front, helping to identify local leaders, coordinating interagency data collection, coordinating interagency team to support and execute planning, and then participating in the planning process. So Lily, it sounded like you kind of pulled all of this together in, to me, this reads like this is the suite of staffing supports that would be available, that the group might want to recommend, which should be available at different points along the way. Do you want to say anything else about this particular part 1?
I think when we had that conversation with the small group, folks were really interested in providing on-ramps and outreach and making sure that that was a priority. And so I think that's what this part 1 is about, the outreach part of it, at least the first couple of bullets. And then theoretically that those regional folks would stay with the process throughout, whether that goes through implementation or whether it's just through the planning process. It just details that.
And then part two was, creating some kind of easily accessible material that would include a pre-application checklist. So it's again, sort of this on-ramp support for potential conveners, planning groups to preliminarily assess whether place-based planning is the best tool to meet their needs and their initial capacity and readiness. So remember last time you all talked about the difference between there being kind of a data ready piece and then community ready. And there was a lot of conversation at the last meeting around, well, we don't want the state telling communities that they're ready or they're not ready. But there was also a recognition that there's got to be some way for the local groups to figure out what does it take to actually be part of a place-based planning effort? And are there some resources and supports that might be structured into this that would assist with that? So that my recollection is that's where this is coming from. Again, Lily, if you want to fill in some pieces on this, please do. Okay, Kaylin?
Thanks. And actually, it might be helpful to leave those up if possible. Thank you. So I mean, in general, I think that like this makes sense. I think there's a lot wrapped up in here, though. Like for instance, when I look at some numbers 3 and 4 here under part 1, these are huge funding and capacity issues. We saw from the place-based planning pilots that certain agencies were not allocated funds to participate in place-based planning, and it hurt the process. I'm curious if, because we're looking at one narrow part just through this portion of the meeting right now, elsewhere in the proposal, is there a tie back to fund those interagency teams and the interagency data collection, analysis, and technical support? That's where, like, yeah, I think if there is, if that's there, then you get closer to being able to say, yeah, then having a centralized coordination person makes a lot of sense. If those people aren't there to coordinate, then and that data is not there to coordinate, it's nice words on a page. That's perhaps a bit overly blunt, and I apologize for that, but it kind of goes to how everything's connected here.
Yeah, I definitely read it a little bit of the same way. I mean, I appreciate it, but I didn't know if it would work out in practice. Like to say at a minimum, that 3 and 4 is like huge. I'm like, wow. I mean, if I could just tap right into that for our process, that's huge. But I also know that WRD pulled their resource from our South Coast because they don't have the capacity last year either. So there isn't even a person that comes to the South Coast but one time a month. And he's great. But, it's just, it's like, it's dreamy. But I'm curious of, if we set this in place, does that sort of signal to WRD that they're going to need to staff up, and is that money there for them to staff up? I don't know what it sort of pushes.
Yeah.
And the other agencies too, to pile on, Kelly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I really liked it though, too, because it does reflect the reality of the big obstacle that's out there. If a particular group comes up and identifies a problem in their basin, and it turns out it's a water quality issue more than a water quantity issue, and it's just OWRD, they say, well, that's not really our that we don't do that. That's this other department. And that's what's happened around the state, and people just stop doing things. So I think clearly the big part of the recommendation of the work group is that, yeah, if you're really serious, state, about addressing, water issues across the state, everybody's got to be on board and they have to be funded to do it. I mean, I think that's something that's the big picture recommendation. This stuff is kind of this, how do you implement that. But if they don't do that, yeah, nothing's going to happen. We're a siloed, you know, we have distinct silos for everything on natural resources in the state. And for it to work effectively, we've got to be able to link those silos and have them talk to each other and be funded and work. Or you're right, it's going to be an empty process. But I mean, I'd like to focus on the big recommendation to say, look, you've got to, yes, you have to realize that there needs to be this coordination, there needs to be funding that allows all these agencies to meaningfully work with different people for different problems.
Great. Oh, you're on mute.
So sorry, I'm out of practice. Yeah, I would underline what Dan said, that, you know, this is great in here, but if it's just where it is now, it gets a little buried and you don't really realize the magnitude of the need. So I think really calling this out is maybe one of the primary recommendations, and making sure that it shows up in its own right of, we need money for the agencies, we need data, we need interagency coordination. Not just as, you know, one piece of one recommendation, but as maybe one of, if not the most overarching recommendation.
Funding and staffing for agencies. So why don't we just test that out? I mean, this feels like a very fundamental baseline for a successful place-based planning program. If it were to be evolved and be successful, that the foundational of having well-funding staff and interagency coordination is one of the most important fundamental aspects of the success of this program.
I would like to make a play for agreeing entirely with that statement, Robin, but pulling it out from underneath place-based planning and instead have that be an overarching recommendation for water planning to be successful in any form. Place-based planning might tier under that as one of the things you go do with it. But I think the statement you just made is really like the fundamental take home from the conversations we've had, and probably should sit on its own separate from these revisions to place-based planning.
I'm going to try to draft up what I just said. And we'll do a check on that with the whole group as a fundamental and as a suggestion to pull that out to be a foundational piece that's around water planning in general for the state. Kimberly?
Kimberly, I think you're up.
Oh, hey, Dan, I just had a clarifying question. So on 3, 4, and 5, those apply to folks who have applied to the state and been picked for place-based planning. Is that correct?
You're asking me?
Yeah, 1,
Okay.
3, 4,
Yeah,
and
I
5. So in other words, it's not like the state is on the hook for, you know, Douglas County is doing a planning process and they want the state to do X, Y, and Z. It is directly tied to groups at that point by 3, 4, and 5 that have been chosen for place-based planning.
I don't know if that's how I read that. I mean, again, I didn't write this.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not direct what came out.
Yes, so I guess, I mean,
But I read it just to say that this is talking about, you know, having funding. I'd like what everything that's been said in terms of raising it to a more cosmic kind of level, but, you know, looking just at this, to at the very least, though, have the staff that is going to be there to coordinate, you know, all that stuff. I think it could be at different levels of the tiered. I mean, this is all in this context of this place-based planning thing here, but that that shows that there's a recognition and a need to coordinate all this interagency stuff, which might be at different levels for different groups. It could be still even, I'd have to think about it, or I don't know if it really matters, but you know, the small capacity grant type might also require still coordination, because the group that comes forth to say, hey, we're interested in doing this, and this person, hopefully, the staff would be hopefully be able to say, okay, well, that really falls in the bailiwick of these particular agencies. It could be a health related thing for municipal system. It could be whatever. And that person is going to be there to help coordinate, to do that initial analysis of like, does this look like this is a good place at the first tier, at the little mini tier going off, or it could be in the full. I think it would apply across, you know, across the tiers if we're talking about having, you know, someone who wants to go this way. And, you know, including that whole analysis that like Kristen mentioned, that in terms of like, is this the right way to go at all? I mean, another agency might say, well, really doing this kind of place-based planning isn't the best way to accomplish that. We might suggest something else, or whatever it happens to be, and, you know, other tools. You know, but I think having that some point, and whether it's or whoever it is, there's some point person that the potential group can go to and kind of work that, you know how the system works and help them out. So I think it would apply to, you know, the whole, to broader.
Yeah, and I guess the concern is like, so there's the interagency person, right, the coordinator, but then like 3 and 4, does that mean if some group that's not connected to place-based planning at all, somewhere in the state, does that put like ODFNW and DEQ and WRD on the hook to do all this work for them when it may not be a priority for these agencies, or for the state for that matter, if it's outside of place-based planning? So just something to think about as this is being refined.
Yeah. Actually,
I
I
don't.
wonder if Raquel or Lily could talk about, because I think the context within which Dan, you and Bobby and Jeff had been talking about this was, there are some coordinators that exist out in the world that some folks have said have been really helpful, that are broader, I believe, than place-based planning. So Raquel, can you speak to that a little bit? And of course, this is tied in this moment to place-based planning, just with the assumption that that's what this group is working on. But we could expand this conversation a little bit broader than that if that's where this is going. But is Raquel on with us still?
Yeah. You're referencing like the complex basin issue coordinators? Is that what you're getting at, Robin? And our public engagement coordinators?
Lily, you'll have to fill in the pieces since you were in that conversation with that small group.
Yes, I think that is what they were referring to.
Okay, yeah, so we have recently received positions from the 2021 legislative session. We've received some positions to work on public engagement, and we've received 2 positions to work on complex basin issues. We also have an ask in our agency request budget for additional positions for the complex basin issues. And the engagement coordinators are supposed to essentially be working on engagement strategies, I guess you could say, for the work that the agency is doing. At the moment, because we don't have enough staff to cover all of the state, we have tried to put engagement coordinators to cover portions of the state where there's not complex basin coordinators. And the complex basin issues coordinators are primarily focusing on issues in the, currently we say Northwest region, and then the Central region. And those positions were received for particularly the Willamette reallocation issues and the broader issues in the Willamette, and then also in the Deschutes Basin, given a number of issues of interest in that basin. So that's where those positions are primarily focused at this point in time. And the idea is to be able to have positions that are high level, that can engage with the basins and also interface within the agency and to the extent necessary with other agencies in order to move forward issues that the agency sees as being integral to that basin. So, for example, some of the issues that are coming up in the Deschutes relate to the mitigation program that we haven't really been able to make progress on in recent years due to a lack of staffing. And of course, in the Willamette Reservoir reallocation, which is these are pretty challenging issues to work through. And so the idea is to have folks that have really high level skill sets in order to be able to bring staff together internally, as well as to also work with basins on these issues.
So that sounds broader than just targeted toward place-based planning.
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, the two basin coordinators at the moment are not really targeted at place-based planning.
So I wonder if this is is this tied to the conversation we just had, work group, about, this recommendation needs to be pulled out and broader than just place-based planning? Just want to kind of feel you out on that. And Kelly, I saw your hand up. 2 thumbs up. Can we get other people to weigh in, especially those we haven't heard from, please?
Would you want me to wait on someone else before I say something?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, that's fine.
Adam's a thumbs up, or is your hand up? Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Dan, as you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, I just was going to observe that, it's not maybe perfectly laid out, but I mean, we do have the recognition in this document that the department put together that there may be a preliminary recommendation that place-based planning is not the best tool for the particular group or problem, whatever it is that gets, comes at that first level. And this goes back to this coordination person. I kind of feel that all melds together, where that coordination person, if they're really, good at it, will say, okay, well, yeah, given your situation, you're really better off doing something else. And knowing what it is, might be another agency, might be another program, it might be whatever it happens to be, and they can kind of do a little triage on that. And so I think it's sort of incorporated in there, but with that, I still think, having the broader, I think it just like we discussed earlier with the whole thing being a broader question of funding and capacity, that I think that applies here. I think part of it's in there already, but maybe I don't think it hurts to be broader. So I'm all thumbs up.
Okay, just feeling people out. We're not doing a, yeah, that Bob says, yeah, that. Sorry, Kelly, Kristen, Kimberly. We haven't heard from a number of you. Anton, we haven't heard from.
Speaking out of turn, Kaylin had in the chat that she needed the question restated to give a thumbs up or thumbs down or halfway. Could you do that just so we're all on the same page?
Yeah, I think the question I was posing was just
Sorry, before you launch into it, Robin, could someone just write it in the chat, because it's now been restated a couple different ways, and some of us are visual and some of us are auditory, and some of us aren't even on the call. Like, for instance, I know Oriana had to drop off, and So it would just be really helpful if this could be formulated into a written prompt. I appreciate you trying to restate it in words orally, but in writing too would be really welcome. So thanks. Sorry to jump in.
No, it's helpful. I'm starting to formulate it in the chat. It was just a pretty general question of, as you're thinking about, now that you've heard Raquel kind of describe what the role of these kind of basin, what are they called? Basin coordinators, or I don't want to get the staff.
Yeah, we've been talking about them originally kind of as complex issue coordinators. We've since changed them to basin coordinators, just so we're not, calling out the complexity of issues, right? For basins. Maybe just one other thing, since I'm already talking, that I would add is that areas that we've also noted where this is helpful would be helpful is, for example, in the Klamath Basin, many of you know Tom Paul, who is our former assistant director, who's now a special assistant to the director, and he exclusively only works on issues in the Klamath Basin. So another example of areas where there's significant complexity that requires a staff person to really be dedicated to the work. We have similar levels of work going on in Northeast Oregon, and the director has been really involved in that because we just don't have enough staff to make sure that they're really honing in on the issues in the area. But it would be beneficial for us, from our perspective, to have these coordinators to really understand the issues in the basin and be able to help move issues forward.
Okay. Trying to formulate the question, Kaylin. So I'll let other people kind of chat and then we'll get it in here. Kristen, April, and Kate.
Can I go? Sorry, I've been.
Oh, I'm sorry,
for a long
Kelly.
time. No, it's okay.
Your
But
hand is camouflaged with your background. I
No,
apologize.
it kind of is. I should have
Sorry
made
about
it a Simpsons yellow. I'll
Go
try
ahead.
next time. What I was going to say is kind of formatty, but when you're looking at these recommendations, they actually seem a little flip-flop to me. Like the first one says, that part one, it's that they're like going to facilitate through the place-based planning, but then it has like consultating, that people are interested, looking at leaders. And then the part two is like, we'll create materials and see if this is something good for you or not. So to me, honestly, like, I don't know if this is just formatty, but the part two looks like part one, and it goes with bullets 1 and 2. And then if you sort of look at the consultation, see if you're interested in undertaking it, if it's going to happen, then you would go into part 2, which is then bullets 3, 4, and 5, where you're actually engaging with OWRD. And at that point, then there is data, there's teams, there's participation in planning process. So it just, I think a slight better organization of process would also help that recommendation. But
Okay. Lily, are you catching that suggestion? Okay. All right, Kristen, April, and Kate.
I wish I remembered who made the comment, but someone spoke earlier about, a group for place-based planning may come together that meets the essential elements that are outlined, but the issue they're working on is not a priority for the state. And so ending up in a position where we've really directed all of this expensive interagency coordination and data collection towards something that may not be a priority, I think is a concern that might also be worth elevating outside of this place-based planning conversation, and instead living in overarching recommendations that there needs to be some state level determinations of where these priorities are and what our priority concerns are to address, so that we just don't burn tons of resources kind of solving low tier issues and never getting to the really emergent, very high level concerns. So I was just going to propose that as one other thing to pull out of this space and instead have kind of an overarching recommendation.
Okay. Sorry, April.
Thanks, and I'm seeing the question there in the chat, and so fortunately my comments are actually on the thing we're talking about, which I wasn't really entirely sure. So trying to parse this out a little bit, because I think that's something that needs to happen with this particular recommendation. I am not comfortable with giving a thumbs up on it as it is currently worded. I think it needs some more work, and that is both wordsmithing as well as parsing out the components and being specific as to what we are recommending when it comes to a place-based planning program or a pathway to help support communities in their water planning efforts. And so a few thoughts, and this is commenting on a few of the other comments that have been made. So I know some of you are aware of this, and for some of you that are newer to the water space or engaging, trying not to go both too far in the weeds or too far up above, but the complex basin positions that Ms. Rensier was referring to, I would like to highlight that while we were supportive of those positions being funded and worked with a number of interests, including those both water user and conservation that are on this group, the package for the previous budget cycle where the Water Resource Department had proposed getting funding for those and other types of positions, that was not actually included in the governor's recommended budget. And for those of you who know how that works, the next governor will be coming up with her budget, and they determine what the department is able to actively actually even ask for. And were it not for folks like many of us on this call, the Willamette and Deschutes Basin would not have those additional staff people. And so I mentioned that because it was hard to do that, and I'm really glad we were able to get those funded. But there are a whole lot of needs just in those basins alone. And I know the Deschutes one is more than Deschutes, but it is much greater of a need beyond what place-based planning or whatever you want to call community water resources planning. And I think we need to be very mindful in that the legislature that's coming in is going to be a lot of new folks, folks that are coming back. Most of them have never went through budget shortfalls, which let's be clear, that's going to happen. And I think it's something we need to be very mindful of in how we frame our recommendations. And so I'm not trying to say that this stuff isn't important so much as that we need to be maybe framing it in a way. And so specific on this one, to me, I don't want, well, one, we need to be clear about putting unfunded mandates upon the agency. And then if we are asking for the legislature to fund it, it's going to be more successful if it's framed in a way of this is something the state needs. It could be helpful to communities that are looking at doing planning efforts, but that's not the only purpose or need for us to have additional staff to work on these complex basin issues, of which we have many. The other related component of that is when it comes to data. We know, and those of us who advocate on these issues know that there's a huge need for additional water data. Again, that is another issue that is a much higher priority than anything we're really talking about when it comes to helping support communities planning. It's an essential ingredient to those efforts, but the importance at the statewide level, there's a whole lot of other things that come in to why we need that data. And so I think to the extent that things like that, this work group can say, we're supportive of there being additional funding for data, or it would be good for the agencies to do a gap analysis. And that would be helpful to be supporting communities as they're doing planning around their water needs, but don't have that be a barrier or have that be a thing that all of a sudden is our main piece, when I think the other part is, the guidelines and how we prepare the pathways for communities to go, what sort of things do they need to be competitive. The other part, and I apologize, but I'm trying to frame my previous thoughts with the thoughts that other folks have said, but it's also something where we need to look at not all areas need to have this readiness assessment. I think some places we have a good understanding. There's places in the Deschutes, and I know Kate's after me, so I'm sure she's going to add all sorts of things, but there are places that are at different stages and have in many places already identified where their gaps are. And with the precious resources that this state has, I think, again, we just need to be strategic in how we're emphasizing or in other ways de-emphasizing what folks should be looking at. The last part that I'll mention, and I was struggling with how to best frame it, in other non-water related instances, there's, looking at the market conditions and how that dictates, for example, what goods are produced. And there's a similar corollary, I think, when it comes to place-based planning or any other types of grants, frankly, that could support good things at large, is that if you build it right, they will come and they will use it. And rather than try and figure out what people need and create overly constrictive boxes when it comes to funding, I think it's creating the pathway and then letting the communities who need these things be the ones that are driving what becomes the priority, rather than flailing about and assuming that every area needs the same level of analysis or the same level of staff engagement. So I hope that somewhat made sense, and I will engage further on other points. Thank you.
Thanks, April. Peggy?
So I'm going to go back to how I started the meeting. That what I was trying to get at, and what I think I'm hearing from most people, is that we all recognize that without our water agencies having the appropriate funding and staffing, it doesn't matter whether we do place-based planning or anything else, that we really have to first start with that. That we have to make sure that the agencies have the resources and the data that we need in order to do whatever, including place-based planning. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't have an objection to the 3 and 4 that are on the list for today, but we need those if we're going to be successful with place-based planning. But before that, just to do anything with water planning, we need all of that. And I don't know how else to say it, but it does take 2 steps. And I really appreciate April's comment about the fact that we're going to, when it gets to the budget side, we're going to have to be strategic and asking.
All right, thanks, Peggy. Kate?
Yeah, thanks. So at this point, I'm just really underlining a lot of what April said and now Peggy said, but I have to chime in since in the Deschutes, we have a complex basin coordinator, thanks to many of you on this call for helping us get that. And we are doing, our own form of place-based planning, but this position is much broader than that. And we've always had a great relationship with our local OWRD staff, but this complex basin coordinator, and she's only been on board for a few months, is absolutely a game changer, and would advocate for that in high priority areas across the state to the extent we can get those folks in place. But I just want to reiterate, that's just one example of the kinds of things, and Peggy just summed it up. We need, and I guess going to your recommendation in the chat, I think that partially captures it, Robin, but it's so much bigger than having OWRD do some public engagement. It's really having, pulling out of the place-based planning frame and going higher. And when you think back to what this work group was actually originally charged with, and we've narrowed it, but we were charged with how does the state engage with communities in regional planning. And I think in my mind, we've really, come to the fine point of the most important things are data and department agency funding and interagency coordination. Once you have that, there's all sorts of things that can fall out. And, if a community wants to do place-based planning and qualifies, there's, obviously engagement there with the data and the state resources. But I think I'm hearing people feel like maybe even a recommendation of this group is not just place-based planning plus, but first and foremost, if we're going to do any kind of regional planning in the state, we need data and we need our agencies to have the appropriate capacity to do those things. And I would also agree with Kristen and others' comments on prioritization, since we know that we're not going to have unlimited funding.
So I'm going to pause and just put in the chat, circling back. And I think just to everybody's beginning of the meeting points about, we've talked about some things, we've sort of carried things forward. How is this all fitting together? So I'm just going to take us back, and I want to just acknowledge in the chat as well. Ileana had a comment. I very much agree with you, Peggy. I think April's pathways comment is critical. There needs to be a baseline of data, staff, and funding, but there should also be flexibility in how places build on that and start projects. Nikki says, I concur with April's comments. Peggy says, agreed, Ileana. Kaylin says, possible top recommendation as to imperatives is to fund water data collection analysis and fund staff. So I'm going to take us back to your what were captured as data recommendations, data and technical analysis recommendations from a couple, 3-4 meetings ago. And we did actually confirm sort of a consensus on this, although I will acknowledge that I don't think every single work group member weighed in on this. So I'm just going to ask you to pause and read this for a moment. And for those that you're not on the Zoom except for phone, I'm going to read it out loud. So the first one was that the state should commit to collecting, processing, interpreting, and distributing water data for effective water planning in Oregon. The legislature should fund what you're calling, quote, situational assessments for basins across the state to understand basic data and also data gaps in each place. This would help the state and communities understand if there is a need for place-based planning. The data would be useful for all sectors, even if the place chose not to pursue planning. And then the second one was, the state should fund the appropriate level of agency staff needed for interagency data collection, analysis, and technical support, and coordinated work planning and budgeting to ensure robust participation from an interagency team. The wording around that might need to be cleaned up just to clarify what you mean by budgeting and ensuring robust participation. But I feel like these are the essence of what y'all are talking about in this conversation right now. And so pulling it out broader than place-based, like making these fundamental and foundational recommendations to, the state around what you think the priority for successful water planning in general. And so Kristen's saying the data doesn't have to tie to place-based in my mind. Again, it's just one potential pathway. So again, yes, pulling this out of kind of a broader statement from this group about those fundamental needs.
Your language there, though, says to determine if there's a need for place-based planning. So just.
Well, yeah, it's not my
your
language.
language.
It's where we left off at the where y'all agreed. But we're evolving the conversation in the moment. So yeah, I want to just acknowledge that what you all are talking about is these are fundamental pieces for effective water planning in general, not just place-based. So Anton, and it's in the chat, Kimberly.
Yeah, thank you, Robin.
I put it in the chat, Kimberly.
Those are nice, long, wordy recommendations, but it sort of strikes me that maybe Kate hit on the trifecta there. Really, it's just data, staff capacity, and interagency coordination. I mean, in my mind, that's sort of simply what it is, and then we can certainly get into details from there. But as far as moving the state forward, I would think it's just those three things, very simply. But just a thought.
Yes, and the point I was trying to make was that is exactly it. And then the second part is if we're dealing with this place-based planning work that we've been dealing on, those are foundational to be able to have a successful place-based planning. But first, the issue that you just suggested. Right? And thank you, Anton. That's exactly correct.
It was Kate. I was just saying what Kate said.
So can we hear from JR, Donna, Margaret, Lauren, Nikki?
This is Donna.
Thank you.
So I agree with what Anton just said, is having those high priority. Definitely not every basin is going to need place-based planning. There, some basins have come to me and said, you know, we don't need it. We've already done it, or we already have our projects. So obviously, I know when the Upper Grand Ronde applied before I became commissioner, there were 4 it was a competition and only 4 were able to move forward because of the amount of funding that was available. So, you know, I would think that that would be similar. Obviously, there's not going to be funding, you know, for everybody, but maybe having that list of who would prioritize for that funding, who needs the planning more than maybe another basin, that kind of thing. Just a thought.
Okay.
This is Lauren from Farm Bureau. Yeah, so obviously I took over for Marianne, so I haven't been on every one of these calls up until this point, but I agree with Commissioner Beveridge on what you just said, which is, I guess, where I'm sort of, I mean, I guess by the nature of being new is my understanding from what I know about place-based planning is that it is still a competitive grant program. So if there's multiple people applying for it, then the ones who are most prepared and most ready would be the ones that get the funding. So I guess where I'm tripping up is why we're struggling to set all of these parameters around us saying who's the most ready, when if we have multiple people who are applying, they'll weed themselves out through a grant process of competing with one another with readiness. So if you have multiple people applying and they're all bringing themselves forward and saying, this is why we should get this grant, this is what we're bringing to the table, this is who we're bringing to the table, this is why we want to do place-based planning. It's a competitive grant process, the same way some of the other grants are. So I don't know why we have to tell them why they're ready. They'll tell us why they're ready to get the minimal amount of funding the state has, because it's not like we're overfunding this program. There's very small amount of funding that the state is allowing for this program, as it were, anyway. So
There's one agreeing with you. State should not be determining whether a community is ready or more important than others, except through the competitive grant process. Thanks. My prioritization comment was related to the water crisis issue of concern, not necessarily who's ready to do planning. Kelly likes Kristen's addition as well, Kate and Kaylin. So I was going to ask you that, Kristen, when you say prioritization, you mean what?
I meant there's a multitude of water issues around the state, and some are more pressing, either because it's drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people somewhere, or we're having a dire economic crisis because of something that's happening, or we know that in 5 years, you know, we're going to walk off a cliff and we've got to get in front of that. Versus some of the other potential issues, you may have a group of people that are really coming together in a great collaborative way and have diverse representation, those things, but they're working on an issue that's kind of, you know, tier 3, not tier 1 or 2 in the list of issues of concern. And so I just want to make sure that our limited state resources are being put towards the problems we most need to solve. And I appreciate that as I say that, you know, you can bring in a whole bunch of equity concerns and things like that. And so that's tricky space to navigate, but, and I want to be thoughtful about that. But my point is really more around, we've got a handful of really big water problems out there. Let's make sure we're working on addressing those. And I think that's irrespective of whether it's place-based planning or something else you're doing to solve it. But let's as a state start thinking about where we most need to invest some resources in getting ahead of these problems.
Okay. So let me check in with Margaret and Nikki and JR. And then Daniel will come to your comment in the chat. So Margaret, do you want to weigh in?
Certainly, I think we're, as most times when government is trying to do something, we're trying to make it as complicated as possible. I say let's lift the place-based planning sunset. Maybe we've talked about a new place-based planning, maybe it just fund water planning for those who would like to engage a bit in it. I know 6 counties that would like to become involved. Say that there are 20 groups that want to. The state could put forth $6 million. That would fund it at $150,000 a shot for the biennium. People could get some basic planning done. The simple problem that we have is that we have a finite amount of water. So whether it be in Deschutes County or in Tillamook County, the problems are very similar in that respect. And we need to find out how we can implement the efficiencies that are necessary and the storage that's necessary to plan for the future. So I mean, I think that this conversation has progressed this morning, and that people are getting down to the fact that the state needs to be able to fund planning on a local basis, and that we do need data and capacity, and counties need capacity, or cities need capacity, or planning groups all need some initial capacity to get something started and then develop from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. JR, are you on the call? And then Nikki, would love to hear from you as well. How about Nikki? I know you're driving, or if you're in a good spot to say something.
Perfect. I just pulled over so I can unmute and send that message. You know, I'm feeling really good. There's a lot of good synergies today on where people are at, and I'm agreeing with like nearly all the comments. You know, I think our charge was really broader about water management, and I think to Kate's point and how Anton summarized it was perfect. I think for our original charge, like, you know, to tell that if we're going to dream big, I mean, the state's going to have to figure out what they're going to prioritize to fund. But if we're going to dream big and how they should really do water management, I think there's a lot of synergy under the data that's required, basin assessments. I mean, ideally, every basin would have a basin coordinator that could help with these kind of things and work with people on multiple levels. There'd be a place-based planning funding for those people that need multiple groups to come together to solve complex problems. I mean, ideally, that's what the state should be doing. I think to April's comments, it's really challenging to get the things that should be done funded. Through Oregon, there hasn't always been an investment in natural resources management. And I think that's why I get frustrated sometimes with these processes, because we all come up with these great recommendations and the state decides not to fund them. And so I think if we could kind of boil down to what the state should be doing on the data, the staffing, you know, and the staffing, I think related to basin coordinators would be really great, because then you'd have that person. I do agree, and I couldn't tell who made the comment. My personal opinion is, you know, the state should put together some guidelines or checklists or something so people can assess their own readiness, and then they compete in a competitive grant process. I mean, if you have basin coordinators, those people could help, you know, on their readiness, but at the same time, it's a competitive grant process. And I think we are going to have to pick and choose priorities here on what's and advocate for those at the state level. So I prefer some kind of guidance document on readiness versus a lot of staff time spent on that. And then but that doesn't mean every basin doesn't deserve a basin coordinator to help people with a lot of different things. It's a really different role than water masters play. They pay, you know, they're much more in a regulatory function than a planning and support function. So I'm excited today about all the conversation and how much I'm agreeing with. So I think that's a good place for us to move forward.
All right, JR.
Yeah, sorry, I've got a bad feed today, but I heard my name. I don't have any substantive comments today, and I think that part of what I believe my role is on this is to provide background on what we've gone through, not try to dictate what some of the folks on this group are needing for their future planning efforts, because we've already gone through it. So I'm not disappointed, nor not going to provide any substantive recommendations. It's just been a good conversation to listen on.
Great, thanks. Well, that brings us to our break. And I think the primary message I'm getting out of this is we have this kind of set of fundamental, potentially articulated recommendations, advice to the state about foundational pieces that need to be in place for good water planning. And then what we've been doing over the course of these conversations is zooming in since August on how would you make place-based planning the tool the best it can be. And so we're in 2 conversations in that today. And so I'm feeling like one, the way that we've kind of organize and formulate your report will be kind of sections that are that kind of broader fundamental piece, and then looking more specifically at the place-based planning tool and determining if and where you all agree on certain recommendations related specifically to place-based planning. But there are these bigger fundamental pieces that I'm hearing pretty clearly are really important to this group to make strong statements around. And so we want to make sure just that we get the language right, that people feel good about. I'm also hearing keep it simple, Margaret and others, about place-based. You know, you're here because you want to make sure place-based planning is able to continue. And others have been really invested in talking about how to really make that tool the best, to optimize that tool. So those are all in play, and we're getting there. And then I want to just also acknowledge April and others' comments about, you know, being really strategic about, you know, what really you're asking for. If you're asking for everything, like, is there also a way that you want to say, these are the most important things that we feel like the legislature should fund with regards to water planning in the system? So Kimberly, and then we do need to take a break. You're on mute.
Sorry. I just want to make sure that in the discussions going forward, there is room to have a discussion about narrowing, because I feel like I've heard a number of people today say data staffing, like, you know, even just having basin assessments would be a win. So I think we should leave ourselves room to be able to have that discussion. And I think that plays somewhat into the points that April was making about budgeting and prioritization. So just want to put that on the record.
Can you say more about what you mean by narrowing?
Well, you are saying that there's sort of these 2 conversations that we're having, but honestly, it does seem like a lot of the energy of this group the really positive energy has been around the need to have, you know, basin assessments or, you know, the data across the state. I'm not, you know, different people use different words. And that's a really foundational piece for place-based planning or any planning. The other pieces, it seems to me that there is not as much alignment. You know, there are a lot of the words matter. I'm not sure we have time to massage all the words. So if we can't get a document with, you know, the 25 recommendations, sort sort of massaged to a place that everyone is comfortable, I would agree with statements made by earlier commenters that it would be a win if we got the legislature to fund this, the data, the basin assessments, and the agency capacity to do that work.
All right, we'll check in with the group on that after the break. All right, I really appreciate this discussion. And also appreciate that you probably need a break at this point. So let's take a break until 1:30. We'll be back at 1:30 to resume the conversations. Thank you. Just bringing people back online. That was a quick break. All right, we'll give everybody just another minute, but if you're back and you're a work group member, if we could just see your friendly face. I see you, Oriana, back on video in a moment. Thank you. Or send me a chat or put something in the chat that says you're back. Thanks, April. Lauren, thanks. Margaret, Donna. I see you, Bob. Okay. All right, so let's press on. Had a little side chat with the project team. I think what we're wanting to do is test out a question around developing a recommendation related to the fundamentals that you've been talking about this morning. And dealing with some of the place-based specific tool improvements that you have been working on, and not forcing that into a binary choice. So we're going to start with a question, and Jenna, I don't know if it's easy enough for you to put a poll together. It would be helpful. This is not a formal consensus check on this. This is a gut check. We need to put language together that sort of it is reflective of the evolution of the conversation you've had so far. And then if there's kind of agreement to proceed with developing a full recommendation around this, which I assume there probably will be, but we need to check. Then we'll ask folks to weigh in on what, if any, level of kind of more detail or specificity do you think will be important in the remaining time that we have in this process to build these things out. So starting with the fundamental question, I'm going to put it in the chat, and then Jenna, she's got a poll ready to go. This is a gut check. And pardon me if the words aren't perfect, but we can talk about sort of making sure we're all clear on what it is that we're asking. Related to, should there be a recommendation from the work group related to the legislature adequately funding interagency coordination, data collection and analysis, staff capacity, and strategic prioritization related to water planning and management? So this is a question of, do you want to build this as a fundamental recommendation? And you've got some of the words, we've sort of done some early tests on this, but it's really taking it into a broader lens of fundamental kind of pieces that are needed for good planning and management in general. And then we'll ask about building this out into something more detailed or specific in a moment.
And just to clarify, you're suggesting this sit overarching, not tiered under place-based planning.
Yeah, overarching, thank you.
Just, yeah.
Yep, and overarching. Yes.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, I heard a lot of support for the, you know, the data and the staffing, but not necessarily staffing for any planning. So I guess that's like, I agree with half of it, but not the full. Maybe I don't need to say that out loud, but I guess maybe I wasn't tracking, but is this what other folks thought the question was? The tail end of it. So in other words, I think we've had a lot of discussion on, you know, basin assessments, funding the state to have the capacity to do those basin assessments. And we have talked about if there's place-based planning, we certainly need to fund all agencies to have the capacity to be in there. But I think that's a different question than having staff capacity for all agencies for any and all water planning, which is a whole different nugget in my mind.
Kim, this is Kelly. I think I read it from just some of the other comments in the room where we had talked about that regional place-based planning may not be the actual, you know, solution moving forward, but it might be a different process. So I guess I don't read it as like they can just do whatever they want and somebody has to show up at the table, because I think there will be a set of filters that's going to say whether your process is a good process, even if it's not the PBP process. So I guess, I don't read it I didn't read it as like they just have to do whatever we say, whether it's a good process or not. But and that's what I was like sort of hearing you say, that it would be like any process no matter what, but I didn't take that from it.
How's that rewrite for you, Kimberly? And April, because you agreed as well. Sorry, Jenna, hold on a second. Or if you could offer a rewrite, that would be even better. So I'm not guessing what you wanted to see here.
I would just stop. I mean, it might be two different things, but I would just stop after analysis at this point. I think that's where you know, in previous meetings, I think 2 meetings ago, that's where everyone was very supportive. I heard different points of view on whether it should expand beyond place-based, whether state support should expand beyond place-based planning or not. Some people agreed, some people did not. And or again, as I said at the outset, I think everyone has a different filter on all these questions, so they mean different things to different people. So.
Anton, you captured a nugget that people seem to say, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Can you offer that, please?
I think it was just the simplest version, which I believe is what Kimberly just said, you know, focusing on interagency coordination, data collection and analysis, and staff capacity. I think that's what you were saying, Kimberly. But that seemed like the barest bones of where maybe we've found agreement, but I don't know. I could be wrong.
Adam and April. This is.
Thank you, Robin. So I want to make sure I understand the question here. And I agree with much of what has been said, and I certainly do support Anton's simplistic view of the discussion this morning, this afternoon. And if I look at the most recent language that you posted, Robin, you say that the legislature adequately funding interagency coordination, data collection, and analysis, and strategic prioritization related to water planning and management. I'm kind of viewing funding as a I don't want to say it's stand alone. I think that having gone through the place-based planning process here in this region, the program was underfunded. And I think funding in general is for water planning or addressing water issues in the state of Oregon, in anywhere in the Northwest or the West is a priority. We don't have the luxury of necessarily addressing this issue when funding is available. I think the funding piece and the recommendation from this group to the legislature is that funding is necessary to address the issues with respect to water in Oregon, or we risk making it to the men's room. I don't know. It's going to be tough if we can't address issues in Oregon if we're not. Yes, I guess planning is important, but funding seems to stand alone in this entire conversation to me. And while I can agree, and I have enjoyed the conversation today, we need our lawmakers to take a look at this issue and agree that funding is fundamentally the most important aspect of what we're doing here with respect to planning for water in the future. Because without that showing up to this conversation, without that serious viewpoint, we're going to be struggling in the future, and we see it. I mean, we don't have to look far into the future to see that is the condition that we're quickly approaching with respect to managing water appropriately to ensure that it's going to be available for future generations. So I don't know how. I'm not sure if I'm getting to the point I'm trying to make for everyone here. I think we're trying to construct a sentence, but I think I'd like to underscore the fact that funding stands alone in this entire process, and that is a message that, and I believe that there are certain members, certainly with the legislature, that understand that. I think it needs to become a statewide concern. Anyway.
Thanks, Adam. April and Kate.
Thanks. April Snow, Oregon Water Resources Congress. I should have said who I was earlier. So I think trying to mesh some of the thoughts I had with some of the other comments that have been made, I think so the rub for me in not being able to be supportive of the statement as it was previously drafted, and it seems like we've got some different iterations out there, and I like Anton's suggestion is tying it specifically to regional planning and management. And so without wordsmithing, which is a difficult thing for me to try to avoid, I think we're going to need to distinguish between things we think are important generally or period, like this one to me, having interagency coordination, data collection, analysis, and staff capacity, those are important ingredients and things that need to have, that the legislature needs to invest in, that are helpful to support communities as they do planning, but are also way more important or go beyond the scope of what we're talking about in the regional planning, and are essential ingredients to virtually every aspect of water resources management. And I think there's a distinction that we need to make in that these are things we think are important. And then getting back to our charge of, we also are recommending these specific things in relation to water planning and supporting communities as they do that. And as Adam was just mentioning, funding is its own separate bucket. And I think even within that, we've been talking as a group about multiple types of funding, and there's the funding and there's the policy. And I think we're meshing those together in a way that makes it difficult for some of us to necessarily support it. So I think we'll see how all this comes together. Again, going back to my earlier comments about, I need to see it fully in its context, but I think there needs to be some differentiation between recommendations of this group that are funding and policy, and those that are things that we see as being important, period, versus the things that we see as being essential, critical elements that need to be part of whatever we're talking about related to place-based planning or regional planning. Thank you.
Every time I follow April, I have thoughts and then they start cascading. Just to respond to that last comment, I think separating those is wise, but I still think this group, it's in our purview to make both of those buckets of recommendations. And I would encourage us to consider that and not just be in the place-based planning plus bucket. I just wanted to comment that the initial recommendation in the chat, I'm a little uncomfortable taking out the staff capacity piece. And I think maybe that's what I heard April and Anton saying, I'm not sure. But for me, having the data and the analysis and strategic prioritization, that's not enough. We need the state agencies to actually, continue planning and management. I'm okay taking out regional, although in my mind, all water planning and management is regional on the landscape. But that aside, I guess, Kimberly, I'm curious why you don't want to keep staff capacity in there to do the, to continue on once we have sort of a baseline and a prioritization established.
Yeah, and to be clear, I definitely want staff capacity when we have a place-based plan in place. And I know in the there are different levels of planning. Like for instance, what you're doing in the Deschutes is following the guidelines of the place-based planning process. You're trying to meet both in-stream and out-of-stream needs. And, so you're following the guidelines voluntarily, but there are many planning processes where people want to plan for various things that don't necessarily meet those guidelines. So for instance, they don't meet, it's a planning process that's not to meet in-stream and out-of-stream needs. From our perspective, we would not say that is a state priority to invest staff resources on a community or county or whatever planning process that doesn't ascribe to the basic sideboards that we have for place-based planning. So I think that's the problem. We have, as April pointed out earlier, there are limited state funds. There are many, many, many needs, including management needs. Luckily in 2021, the state got a big boost, but there are still many unmet management needs. And so if we dedicate money and or staff to any type of water planning, it seems problematic to me, without sideboards especially.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would assume it would be tied to state goals and sideboards and be a range of planning that served the state goals. But thanks for that clarification. Words matter.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a new one in here, and this is really just to get checked that does this group feel it's important to put forward an overarching, broader than place-based planning recommendation related to fundamental needs that would require legislature to fund data? It's related to data, interagency coordination, staff capacity for effective water planning and management. The details and specifics can be a next step for this work group if you want to try to build these out more specifically, but let's check to see, do you all agree that you would want to put forward a statement around this overarching piece? And let's just do the poll and then figure out where we're at. I appreciate you sticking with this for a minute.
Can we hear from Kaylin and Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah, who do you want?
You're first in the queue, Dan.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just saying, we kind of changed the Kate plus Anton summarization, which I thought was so good. And maybe tying it back in is I think what we're saying is, in terms of what we've been doing, that and where we've gotten to today, is that place-based planning can, if it's properly designed and supported, be a great tool, but without data, agency funding, and interagency coordination, it's not going to go anywhere. So then that sort of, those three elements rise, kind of the top. And of course, that does go outside of place-based planning. I mean, that there's anything else that's going on, it's going to do that. But the staff capacity term might be a little confusing. We were really talking about, the agencies having sufficient capacity, and not just water resource, whoever it happens to be. But I will, just for background, this is going to be, I'm sure most of the choir out there knows this, and I think it, as April mentioned a while ago, funding is there's going to be a decline in the budget. And historically, whenever that's happened, Water Resources Department takes a disproportionate hit because it's almost entirely general funded. Some of the other natural resource agencies have some other occasionally problematic, but they have other funding sources, more federal pass through, certain ability to get fees and things that Water Resources has been pretty limited on. So it really does get hit. So it raises, big issues there. Well, how do you fund, all the natural resource agencies to where they can effectively do what they're doing? But that's, that's a legislative discussion that probably should happen. But again, it's that, data, agency funding, interagency coordination. If you don't have those, it is kind of a, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. There's probably some great expression, fool's journey or something, to advocate for this whole place-based planning system. And then they're going to dump right into these great big obstacles that are sitting there. So I'm just not sure if that's stated clearly in the particular proposal we're voting on.
I think just trying to assess that you want to trend toward developing a recommendation around this so that we can move it into an action item. And I think, to your point, maybe it was a little too implicit and should be explicit. That my assumption is that what you're talking about is these are foundational for all effective water planning and management, including place-based. So that's what I'm hearing in the conversation, is that there are these fundamentals that need to be met in order for any of the tools to be successful. And so getting that at the heart of that, so that you can then talk about optimizing the place-based planning tool as one planning tool. That's, I guess, the trend that I'm hearing in this conversation, but I might be missing the mark. So Kaylin and Kristen, and then we're going to have to move this along.
All right. Thank you. I've got 3 points, I guess. First one is, as I think about staff capacity, I do embrace a broader definition of agency capacity, because the more I think about it, it's both FTE and it's also money to contract. I mean, a lot of this work cannot be done within the various state agencies that are involved with water planning and management. So perhaps we need to be more holistic in how we describe that. The second is, Kristen was going where I was going when I first put my hand up about clarifying that this needs to be in service to the IWRS. In the current place-based planning statute, where there's authority to make these grants, it's nested within the IWRS statute itself. And it's clear that these planning frameworks are, if we want to look at it, it's section 2 of ORS 536-220, and subsection 4 clarifies that these are about regional water plans that are holistic. It's meeting current and future in-stream and out-of-stream needs. I just want to make clear that that's where, like, if we're talking about place-based planning, it's in service of the IWRS. And then third, I think what I'm also hearing today is we narrowed our focus to next generation of place-based planning. And now through these conversations and through our thinking and through having straw proposals to look at, I'm sensing kind of a desire of the group to blow it back up again to the foundations. And, whether we're looking at like what underpins all of this or what overarches all of it, it's like, taking a hard look at whether we need to keep tying this back to place-based planning, or whether we're all finding our energy is around the bigger issues and barriers to effective regional water planning and management. Those are just 3 reflections.
Yeah, let's test that last question out with the group. So let's hear back from others on that question.
I agree.
Who said that? Kristen? Okay. April and Daniel?
Should we drop it in the chat for the visual folks?
Why don't you put it in, since you put the idea out there, Kaylin? Go ahead, April and Daniel.
Yeah,
I'll try.
Thank you.
I would say well, I guess depending on what that means, I really want us, because I know that I've made comments about how supporting the data and the staff capacity, that is important and broader than planning and what we are working on specifically as a group. But I think it's also something where we as a group, while we need to stay focused on, I think, providing tools, guidance, and pathways, sideboards, whatever you want to throw in there related to communities, water resources planning, as a group, we can also make high-level recommendations that are things we've identified that are important and crucial to water resources planning, but also are much more important and have other value beyond the planning program. And so to me, that's just a list of things that I think we have a lot of agreement about, but are more important or have extra value beyond just planning. And then the other part that I don't think I was as articulate as I'd like to be earlier is that I'm not saying that we don't need some of these things for water resources planning, or that we don't have the purview as a group to talk about those things. It's so much that I am becoming more and more cynical every legislative session that I go through. And if we want this to be successful, the more we can articulate how important we think something is, but at the same time, not make it such a complicated statement or so closely tied to planning that if the legislature decides they don't want to approve or extend whatever legislative concept comes out of this for next session, that we've not also killed the momentum that we had, for example, supporting the fact that we need more water resources data, or that WRD needs greater staff capacity on all these other things. So I think, one, it's important that we hone in on our charge around water resources planning, but to the extent that these other things are important, we're like, yep, that's important, but it's also important beyond us, if that makes sense.
Daniel, and then, yeah, Kaylin's got the question in the chat.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful, Robin, since our conversation today, in some ways, we seem to be like going all over the place, and we only have a few meetings left. I think it would be helpful if you or Jenna could reread maybe some part of the purpose that we're put together to solve, just to kind of hear that read. That could help us. But I'm also thinking too that, you know, we get a charge from the legislature, but as we talk, we're coming up with big issues that may be not exactly what we were asked to do. But if we really come together and say, hey, these are real important issues, I don't think we should be afraid to give this information back to the legislature to say, hey, we really think this is important when it comes to solving the water issues. But I think it would be helpful right now to at least hear what we were, you know, what our original charge was. Because I agree that there's so many important things we're talking about, but I think it would help me to hear that.
Jenna's going to grab from the charter. I fear, Daniel, that is the conundrum you all have been dealing with for the entirety of this process, which is what is the scope and focus? And what is happening in this meeting is we pivoted to focus on place-based planning as the tool in August. And now we're, as Kaylin said, it's now become kind of circling back around to some of these bigger fundamental issues. And so her question to the group is, do you all agree the group should restore the original focus on recommendations to address barriers to effective regional water planning and management, which would be agency capacity, data, and interagency coordination? And, you know, trying to ask that question of the group. And also, I don't think this needs to be a binary question. It doesn't need to be you only focus on those barriers or you focus on evolving the place-based planning tool. A lot of you have put a lot of work into the conversation around evolving the tool. And I just think we would be remiss and it would be a disservice to everyone that's put so much work into that piece of it to just say, we're just not going to deal with that now. So I don't think it needs to be an either or. And I just want to pose that to all of you as a process point. My question that I was trying to get out through the poll is it worth you putting together some statement of recommendation around this fundamental piece? And then we can get back into these conversations around improving this place-based planning tool. And I didn't get a strong signal on the poll. I don't think everybody even weighed in. We didn't get any absolutely no's. And I know that there are a handful of you for whom this is the most important piece. And so I just want to invite volunteers to work with Lily to build that piece out. If you would be willing to volunteer, and we'll have you bring something back to the group at the next. So are there folks that would be willing to volunteer on that? And then Nikki, I see your hand up as well.
I was just going to recommend that I think your statement and keeping it simple. We've done a lot of wordsmithing here in ways I'm not sure is incredibly effective. And so I think it captures that. The only word there that I might take out is require the legislature to fund. The word require. I mean, it could be just phrased a little bit to, you know, for effective water management in Oregon, you know, the majority of the group recommends, you know, Oregon consider funding data assessments, interagency coordination, and staff capacity for, you know, you already have the product planning and management,
effectiveness. So you have that in there, but I think if we get, there's a lot of things that different people in this group are going to decide to lobby for or not lobby for in the legislature. And I think those weeds, we don't really have time to get into, but I think overall there's a kind of sounded like pretty good consensus on some of this, but the devil's in the details.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so is there a handful of you that'd be willing to take a shot at crafting something for the group?
Sorry, I should raise my hand before speaking, but you mean crafting something for the group about this overarching concept we're discussing? Yes, I would volunteer to work on that.
Anyone else?
I'd be happy to as well.
Thank you.
I would, but I'm going to be out of the country. I apologize.
Okay, thank you, Kaylin.
I can help if you like. I think.
Bob, did I see you go off mute?
I have time to help too. Got a lot more time to get better educated on this issue. So,
all right, let's go with Bob, Kristen, Kate, and Kelly. Yes, you've been doing a lot too, Kelly. So I just want to nod to you. All right, so we're going to take this offline and have you all try to craft something. We'll share our detailed notes with you, small group, so you can see what the richness of the dialogue from today. And let's take another step forward. And I'm going to ask for permission to change up the order of the ops for today to bounce down to the community engagement piece. And that's because the task group actually has, I think, reached a bit of a conclusion for that piece of the puzzle, and would like to give them an opportunity to bring this forward to you and see if we can get the guide approved and potentially the community engagement recommendations checked for consensus, and then we can move on from that piece, because there's been a lot of work and we have had a lot of time at these meetings to talk about this particular piece. So I'd like to just give a little bit of time for that group to wrap that up. Bob, did you have more? And then I see Oriana. Oh, go ahead, Oriana.
Yeah, I wanted to just do a quick process check because we did the poll and there was kind of holding off on the poll, and I don't know that everyone responded to it. I just want to confirm that this new work group that has formed is kind of taking what that poll would have checked for and coming back with like a broader reframing. Is that a correct understanding of kind of what just played out?
Yes.
and just to close the loop, if of the 4 volunteers minus me, if somebody would agree to take the lead to help coordinate outreach so we could get together to button it up.
Yeah, we're happy to help with the coordination, and I know Lily's willing to be on hand to help with actually scribing and drafting for you all. So we will support that for sure.
Yep.
All right, so I want to pull the community engagement task group forward and also recognize that Kimberly spent some time with the group earlier this week, actually just yesterday, on kind of picking up where you left off in the October 4th meeting, which was, we had just a couple little pieces that weren't quite resolved. One of them being, and I'm just going to find my notes here so I'm saying this right. There was the descriptions for community and community led, which is going to be reframed now, but those 2 descriptions would remain the same in this guide. There was consensus of the group last time around the descriptions, but there was some concerns around the labels of community led and trying to figure out what's the right framing that gets at the intent of what the community engagement task group was offering with these principles. So what we want to do today is give them an opportunity to share the latest update. Jenna, I believe you sent out maybe you didn't actually, because there was some just brief changes. So I think we need to put that in the chat and let people open it up, the most current. And then we'll pull it up on the screen. Thanks. Oh, yes, and Kelly volunteered a little bit later, but wasn't part of the original group. So the original group is Oriana, Adam, Anna, Peggy. Who else is on that group? Apologies. Oh, Kristen, I believe. April, you've been on it, but have had to miss the last couple.
Jeff said something about missing a meeting too, but I don't know if he was talking about that meeting or this meeting.
Who was that?
Jeff Stone had sent out an email that said something about, sorry, missing a meeting.
Yeah, he wasn't part of the original. He was going to join that conversation,
Oh.
but wasn't able to make it.
Thanks.
So for those of you who were part of that discussion, could you help the group lead us out on this discussion, please? And then Jenna, if you want to pull it up for everyone to see on the screen, that'd be great.
Kimberly, do you want to give like the
Sort my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, having issues here. Yeah, I think we had a while back, the group had sent the document out for comments, and we had commented back then. And then, as Robin said, we met with the group this week, and our comments were around, and I think we talked about this in the last meeting as well. There's some tension in place-based planning, at least the two processes that we have been in, around the term community-led as it relates to sort of either state leadership or state partnership. And so we, in reading what the group put together, I think they did a fabulous job on creating definitions that were inclusive and clear, I think sort of clarified some of the tensions that people have run up in the past, but there's still this question about the title of the definition, which is community-led. And we did talk about this last time. We had suggested community engagement, and Oriana had some really good points on why that was maybe not appropriate. And so we continued the discussion, and the group that met yesterday was comfortable with changing that to community collaboration and keeping the definitions generally, except for there were a few tweaks. I think Daniel added something and I added one word. Just that was really about it. And I think, honestly, Jenna, I think we ended up with A as regional planning should be collaborative. That would be period, and then have that, and then have down below it says community collaboration. And I think, so just so folks can track, last time I think it was Daniel who suggested rather than just people who live, that it's a people who live and work. And then I suggested play, just because that terminology is used at different levels of state government to describe place. And then, the other thing we talked about, there were some policy pieces embedded in the document, and we had a discussion about how this document was really about engaging the community and trying to bring people to the table. And so we took those pieces out for discussion with the larger group.
Anything to add from those who were part of that discussion?
Excellent synopsis. It was like a really productive meeting, I felt like. So I'm just going to say that. Thanks for everybody's contribution.
Okay. Um,
Jenna, you didn't take out, if you scroll up, you still have the term community led under, under 5, yeah.
okay. And then were there any other changes further below, Jenna, just so people can see anything that's highlighted in yellow is an update. We just put to be true to the rest of the principles. We just added this like.
And Robin, did you get, you had stated that you thought Bobby was gonna provide some comments on the tribal
On the
section.
tribal,
too?
yeah, he has not had a chance to. So a number of the tribal representatives provided input that's directly reflected in this. But Bobby wanted a quick review of it. We haven't gotten anything specifically back from him just yet. So that is subject to change or to some revision. And so that's one caveat for us approving this today. All right, so there you have it. I think let's just check with folks if there are any concerns with the way the language got reframed to be specific to community collaboration. And then the other thing that the group talked about was this should be a guide that's offered to future place-based planning programs. So it could be a guide that gets handed to groups. It could be a guide that the state or the agency uses as its own sort of guide. There's another question on the table, which is a recommendation that's embedded within the community engagement recommendations that you found in the straw proposal, which is whether to further recommend that the principles, the high-level principles that are listed A through whatever letter, should also be considered part of standards for the state to consider access to funding for place-based planning. So it's sort of tied to the conversation you had earlier about what should be some of the criteria for either qualifying or for accessing state funding for place-based planning. And the small group suggested that these could be at least the basis for some standards that the state would utilize to know whether for groups to access funding. So that's a question on the table, and we really haven't had a lot of conversation about that. But it does feel like it's important. It's taking a next step beyond just here's some friendly suggestions to this actually should be part of your standardization of the program. So what I'd like to do is have us look at those principles and just quickly determine if the group feels good about these becoming standards for what might be developed into criteria, or if you have concerns about that. And I'm happy to put those kind of succinctly in the chat. Sorry. If Jenna or Lily has it more readily available, feel free to pop it in there. Here we go. Thanks, Jenna.
I'm not seeing anywhere yet. Am I missing something?
She's grabbing it.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought it was in there.
I've got it. Oh, sorry, the formatting translation.
That's what I was working on. Sorry for the suspense. I'm adding in bullets too.
Okay, it was on like one of the documents we got too. I don't know if it's easier to just share a screen of that. It was like in the top. I'm trying to remember where it was now. The case of the missing guiding principles.
I'll share my screen here. So these are the principles that are listed in the guide. The regional planning should be collaborative. Should be collaborative. Participation should be balanced and inclusive and should include both in-stream and out-of-stream interests. Regional planning should be transparent and accessible for all. Recognize that tribal engagement is unique and layered. Foster public input early in the process and ongoing. Sustain an informed public. Support trust building between all participants, community members in the state, and demonstrate accountability. Oops. Sorry about that. Keep doing that. So this is what's currently in the community engagement recommendations. Establish a clear set of standards for engagement tied to accessing state funding for regional planning based on the high-level principles from the community engagement guide. They should be considered criteria for grant funding.
What does layered engagement mean?
Good question. That was language based off input we got from some of the tribal representatives, Anton. So it may not be the right wording and or may require some translation.
I'm not going to pretend that I know what the intent behind that word layered is, but I know from working with people throughout tribal communities, whether it's people on council, members of the community, the government associated with those communities. I guess that's the layered I think of when I'm just reading it with my own lens, is that a lot of times, you know, things happen at different levels, same as us with government versus people on the ground doing the work or where the work comes from. So that's what comes to mind when I think of layer, but I do not know the intent behind this passage. But engaging with communities versus the government levels.
Robin, this is Adam. I'm just, Anton, I'm not sure that we actually capture the essence of what we're trying to say with using the word layered. I know that working with the tribes here in the Mid-Coast region, the tribes have a specific set of goals that they pursue and want to protect and achieve. And when we've engaged the tribes with our planning process, their focus and conversation has been to evaluate how the regional planning focus fits within their goals. And I've heard them use the term layered with that. And so I'm not suggesting that's the perfect word here because it doesn't, when I think of layered, I think of engineering terms and layering certain conditions on top of each other, different profiles and things. So this is totally out of context from what I think the definition is here. So if someone has something better, it'd be probably more appropriate.
Yeah, I just wasn't familiar with that term. It might be the completely appropriate term. I'm not familiar with it, so I was just curious.
Some of the other language in there was recognizing the fact that you can't just take a monolithic, there is a tribal perspective, that there are lots of tribes, different perspectives. And I wonder if that's what they're trying to, I'm guessing along with everybody else, but that was used in the other discussion, and I don't see it reflected in that. List.
Let's look at Ileana's comment in the chat.
Yeah, just really quick to that specifically. When you think of tribal governments, you should think of them sort of on par with the federal government, where there's sort of like a big overarching structure, tribal council, the tribal courts, but then underneath that, there's like a natural resource department, and there's different ways to sort of divvy up those departments. So for one tribe, you may be interacting directly with a tribal council representative. Another tribe, you may be working with the director of natural resource departments. For CT Clusie specifically, you're working with me, and I'm a staff member under the natural resources department. So I think the intent of the layered is to capture that not every tribe will have exactly the same position or the same interest in engaging at the same level. I think there are some tribes more out east who are more engaged in water planning than we are on the coast. So taking that into consideration as you approach tribal governments and bring them to the table.
Okay, thank you. That makes a great deal of sense. Yeah, they're sovereign entities. There are governance structures that are unique to each particular tribe, and yeah, certainly tribal viewpoints are not monolithic either, as they are all individual sovereign nations. So thank you for explaining that for me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I guess I was struck by the fact that Anton, you work for a tribe and have for quite some time, and if this word isn't hitting, then maybe we need to look at fleshing out what that word means in this statement. I felt like the discussion around it was really helpful. If there's a way to try to import some of that into the shorthand to make it a little less shorthanded and more meaningful, that might be helpful. I like the intent of D. It's just it sounds like we need some more massaging of it to capture the elements of sovereignty and the elements of there being different ways to engage with tribes and tribal members and tribal governments themselves. And I think a lot of that is unfortunately lost in the unique and layered. So I think it was a good question, Anton.
So Ileana is willing to do some refinement on that. And we know Bobby might be providing some feedback as well. So we'll take this piece offline and let some of those folks work on it. I'm going to have us do a quick poll on the two questions that are at play with the community engagement guide. And Daniel, oops, sorry, he's okay. Daniel had to leave, I believe, but he wanted to let the group know the concept of engagement across the board happens early in the process. So groups are not just consulted after the major issues have been put forth, but have meaningful opportunities to shape the agenda. I think B3 gets at that, but just want to make sure I commented on that as well. Okay. So the first poll, and I see you, April, is on the first threshold question around the guide, which is, do you endorse the community engagement guide for use in future place-based planning? It's kind of a general, like, do we agree with this We think this is an important, it captures what we believe are high-level principles for community engagement and place-based planning. The second poll, which we'll get to in a moment, is whether these should be further established as potentially standards for accessing funding to place-based. So the first threshold question is, do you endorse it as a guide for use? With the caveat that we'll be refining language for the tribal engagement piece.
I guess it's hard to say if we endorse something if there's going to be further refinements to it. And that's
Are you comfortable
feels,
with it feeling like the intent of what you've talked about if it gets captured with the intent and the tribal representatives are able to put the words that they believe are meaningful? Kaylin?
I think it's really hard in that we've been making edits to a document today. We don't have a final, and we're now being asked if we endorse a community engagement guideline that's going to be used to guide criteria. So I guess what I'm saying right now.
Sorry, that's not
the question, right?
There's two questions. The first threshold question is whether or not you endorse the guide and that it should be brought forward for future place-based planning. The second threshold question is whether to further establish the principles as standardization. So actually making a stronger recommendation. So I'm just wondering if you're comfortable with the guide as written, that's reflective of what you all agree are important principles for community engagement related to place-based planning. And if you're not ready, we'll come back to it, Kaylin. I want to see if we can get somewhere with this because there's been a lot of folks and a lot of iterations on this.
Totally. And I think the question I have is around the word use, because there's a lot of different ways that if we're just talking about this being put up as this is a resource that we want to have future place-based planning groups have accessible. That's one question, but it could be used in a whole variety of different ways, if that makes sense.
April?
Thanks. I had my hand up and then I put it down, and then I put it back up.
Sorry,
So,
April.
Well, you should not be sorry, Kaylin, because I agree with a number of your points, but it's also some confusion I was having as well. So I think having participated in some of the community engagement subgroup meetings, I think it's important to recognize the large amount of time that were put by other subgroup members. I only was able to participate in some and contribute, and I think there are a lot of good ideas that have been finessed, and honestly, it has seemed to be one of the more productive conversations that we've had in some of the subgroup levels. But I think I would say that I am conceptually supportive of including community engagement guidelines as something we go moving forward. But to the comments that Kaylin and others and myself made earlier, I can't say that I endorse something. I can't say that I'm supporting something without seeing what the actual language is, and then how that is being nested within the other set of recommendations. But I think it sounds like on this one that we're just looking for a few language tweaks, and I would hope that we can bring that back to the next group or have that further nested within the overall document and reach greater understanding and hopefully shared support of that component. I am less supportive of the second part, which I believe we'll be polling on next.
I'm not sure what to do with this at this point. If y'all aren't ready to do it, maybe we need to give you a chance to give it one final review, and we'll do an email check. If there are community engagement task group members that want to offer any words around this at this point, kind of what the intent that you were bringing behind this community engagement guide and the use of the community engagement guide for place-based planning. It might be helpful to kind of contextualize that for those who aren't quite clear about what we're asking.
I was going to say something, but I'm going to wait for someone else to comment on the use of it who was on the group originally. I think that's probably the most important piece right now.
Oriana?
Yeah, I'll jump in as a member of that task group, and representing, of course, only my opinion and not, all folks in the task group itself. But I think that this is like a set of guidelines, and it's a set of like best practices to be shared with folks. I think I have to think a little bit more about whether it feels okay to kind of take something like this and create more criteria associated with it. But I think we've heard throughout this process from especially folks in the local government space that like some governments have the ability to or some entities that are engaged in place-based planning, I shouldn't say only governments, have the ability to do deep community engagement and have resources and knowledge and experience. And others, it's a newer concept and one that can feel kind of scary and opaque at times. And so this document is intended to kind of help break down some of the what is it and how does it function without being really prescriptive about hey, do this, this, and this every time, all the time, especially because every community is different. And as we've had a lot of really thoughtful discussion in this space, community in the water world can be really expansive in nature and include, different kinds of communities and voices in a collaborative space in different contexts for different basins. So I think at least the intentionality that I went into this space with was receiving feedback from others. I think even in one of the early work groups of hey, it would be really helpful if we had some guidelines for how to do this, and putting this out there to provide that resource and that tool. But it's not a substitute for some of the resources that are needed to actually make this work happen, or some of the support that may be needed from the state or other entities, especially on the engagement with sovereign nations front. So hopefully that was helpful for folks. And definitely if other folks from that task group disagree with my framing or came in with a different perspective, I think it'd be very helpful for folks to hear that.
What did the group say about this last time, Jenna? There was a question of what the intent and use of the guide was. Anna Molina was the spokesperson last time. So we don't have the benefit of having the whole task group in the meeting today. Unfortunately, there are a number of folks that aren't here. So if there's any insight that could be gained from that last conversation. And I think meanwhile,
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to say that Anna had, provided an explanation that the intention for the guide was to be used as a tool, in ensuring a diversity of voices are, proactively, continuously included in a regional planning effort, to Daniel's point that he mentioned earlier. And then Peggy provided some clarification around, the principles were intended to be those standards for how community engagement should happen. So kind of subsequently, the details of the rest of the guide are not, the best practices, sort of bullet points beneath those principles are not the prescriptive pieces by any means, but it's just sort of those overarching principles that would move forward as some sort of standards for the departments or states' consideration.
Is that helpful, Kaylin? Others who weren't sure about the use or intended use?
Sure. I think it's helpful. I think, in looking at the guide, there's a whole section around the purpose of the guide, and it seems like there's a missing section around, use of the guide. That might sound like a distinction without a difference, but I guess what I'm not seeing in here is an announcement of this is meant to be a collection of best practices. This is meant to be a supporting guideline for how to engage effectively with communities across a range of planning processes. So I think that unless I'm missing it I'm not feeling that element of it in here. And I wonder if adding like a paragraph or two about what the intent of the guide is might get us further along on feeling like we're comfortable with it as a tool.
Okay. All right, we can take that back to the task group and see if they're willing to put a little bit of intended use of the guide piece in there so that the rest of you can know what it is that you're being asked to, like, for what this would be used and what you're being asked to either endorse or disagree with. I think we can take not more time on this in the meeting, so we're gonna just table that again, and very likely we'll ask you to please review whatever the final draft is that's their best shot at this, and offer a feedback on your level of agreement with whether or not you support this moving forward. And then we can ask the question of whether or not you think the principles should be used in some version of creating some standards around accessing funding for place-based planning. So that's all going to have to come back to us next time, I guess. And we're going to move on. We don't have much time, but I do want to just allow folks to talk through, at least briefly, so people understand what's behind, again, intent behind your proposals here on the sort of establishing, sorry, let me get to my document here so I'm not speaking out of turn. Related to checks and balances, clarifying the state's role and responsibilities. So on your document, it's on page 2. And we weren't exactly sure where to put this, but it has come up. So we just want to give you a little airtime, Kimberly and Kristen, to talk about this. And it might be, you know, I don't know if this is now pertinent to the conversation you had earlier about those fundamentals, that the conversation we had this morning. So let's just take a look at what you've got here, and we'll see where you want to go with this. So there was one that was around assessing and developing a full suite of water planning tools and identifying which tools or approaches will lead to the most successful outcome in various basins, given geography, community, hydrology, and magnitude of water crisis. Kristen, can I ask if this particular sentiment is something that you assume will be kind of part of whatever gets drafted into that fundamental piece that you and that smaller group are going to work on?
Yeah, I think the conversation this morning eliminates that piece. That was really geared towards some of the language in the last draft that kind of made it sound like the only path forward is place-based planning. And as I was wanting to pull that back a little and say, water planning and management are important, and there's different ways to go about that can fit different situations. So I think, as you suggest, we could just table that for the subgroup conversation.
Okay, thanks. And then Kimberly, you had 2 that I think are very linked. One is the requirement the state needs to provide. And again, is this now linked to this fundamental piece that Kristen and others are going to be working on?
I think, yeah, I mean, this is I think a topic that I've raised since the first or second meeting, which is clarifying the role of the state, because again, in the place-based planning assessment, that is something that people raised, you know, and we have Water Watch has participated in 2 place-based planning processes, and this has definitely come up. So I had just repeatedly said, this is something we need to talk about. These, I can't find where in the framework the comments were made, but and then not even if, as I'm looking at it, this would not be complete. But basically, you know, we think, as we have stated many times, that the role of the state and working under a state framework is critical in the space planning world. We've talked, I think the group as a whole has talked a lot about the data, so needing basin assessments, needing staffing for all the agencies to do that work, not just ODF&W, but I mean, not just OWRD, but also ODF&W, DEQ, et cetera, to come up to have the staff to do the data collection, do the data analysis, do the interpretation. So that's one piece, but then also having the state, which they've done to a certain degree, but just maintaining their role in establishing the scope and the sideboards. Something that did pop up through the place-based planning that we've participated in was a need for neutral professional facilitation with water with subject expertise, frankly, providing for technical writing of the reports is something we think is really critical. And also, again, this was raised in the assessment, is ensuring funding for state agency staff to participate in these planning efforts, not just provide data, but to participate as members, because I think we've talked about this before, but basically, the agencies are there representing the public under whichever mission they are, whether it's ODF&W, WRD, DEQ. And so we do need their voice at the table, weighing in on things such as fish flows or water quality, Department of Ag, etc. So we had suggested, and again, I don't know if you can point me to which subsection of the framework it's in, but that was one suggestion we had at some point. And then there was, I think early on, and again, I think I'd have to look back at V1, we had made a suggestion about the agency role, and this group, and sorry, I don't have it in front of me, and I can circle back on this, but basically, we had suggested I think it was that we had suggested a recommendation that the state, and I apologize for not being prepared on this one. I think we had recommended something that said this, the legislature shall fund this, and there was some pushback. And so the alternative is that if the legislature doesn't fund the agencies, then they don't actually need to provide the work. So in other words, we don't want unfunded mandates. We either need to have a directive that says, we recommend legislature fund this work, or an out for the agencies, so that if planning groups are saying we need this, we need that, but the agencies don't have staff, that the agencies don't have to prioritize these planning efforts over their other work.
Any questions for Kimberly? Or?
So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it might be, if I could, do you know where these are in the document, Robin?
No.
Like what section?
No, in fact, we couldn't figure out where it would go. I think the conversation started when you were all kind of wrestling with some of the terms and definitions, and it became a kind of a big comment and conversation around state role and then community ownership. The two got sort of meshed up. And so the community piece is now kind of getting resolved through the community engagement work. This was kind of hanging out there. So the question maybe to you initially is, do you want feedback from the group on this piece? Do you want to make this into a proposal to make it really explicit?
Well, I do think, yes. I mean, I think the group needs to have the discussion. I think in many spots in these various documents that we've amended or, put comments in, there has been recognition of like the need for facilitate, for instance. And it would, if we are in fact if we take the path where we're continuing to improve place-based planning, having those directives more clearly stated would be helpful. I think I would reword these a little bit,
Okay.
but
Are
I
there
do,
any-
and again, I just flagged it because I think like this, that's one of the big points that came out in the place-based planning assessment. So it seems like discussion is warranted.
Yeah, so I guess maybe just get some initial feedback to you over the next few minutes, and then if you want to take some time to like retool it a little bit and bring it forward for the group. This sounds like it's not
Yeah.
perfectly written. So what are folks thinking about this? Do these as sort of baseline requirements for what the state's role is in place-based planning? Adam.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. Yeah, I think Kimberly, you're right on with this. The expectation here, I guess, is for place-based planning to be successful, it's going to take the input, leadership, involvement of the state in these processes, or state agencies. And I think, yeah, I'm comfortable with the language here. I do believe we could do a little better job of finessing that, but I think it's important to recognize that many of the communities many of the communities that would qualify for this kind of place-based planning lack the capacity to facilitate this kind of activity on their own. And so I think that, you know, having the state step in to do that is going to be, it's going to mean that those communities are going to have the kind of success they need through this process. So I think Kimberly was brilliant that you brought it up here. And I think we need to support you in this effort to include it.
Thanks, Adam.
To be clear, we're only talking about that second bullet right now, correct? Or are we talking about the third bullet as well?
I think we're just talking about the second. The third is, we just need to protect the agencies, frankly. So however we want to do it. You know, I think unfunded mandates are really detrimental to the priority work of states. So if the legislature is not going to fund it, then I wanted to provide an out.
I'm glad you mentioned that second piece of that, Kimberly, because the sentence is strong in itself, but I think that if you add the language unfunded mandate in that, then that helps complete that for me. But I'm sorry, I don't want to wash up bullet 3 yet.
Any other comments on this one? So, I mean, to Kimberly's point earlier, yeah, some of these roles for the state did emerge in several iterations of conversation over the course of the work group, and came out of some of the evaluation from the place-based pilots. So my understanding, Kimberly, is that you're really just trying to put this kind of more overtly into the suite of recommendations that would help evolve and improve the place-based planning tool, and just trying to make that really overt. Okay. Oriana?
Yeah, I just scrolled back in the chat to something that Ileana said that really resonated with me about the need, especially for like smaller entities, to get some baseline data and staff for maintaining that data. I wonder, Kimberly, if you'd be open to a friendly amendment where it's like baseline data, data interpretation, and like support maintaining data, or building out that data piece more, especially because that's been such a common theme in our conversations about a need to have that piece, especially to like get people started.
Yeah, we can work that in. Again, if it's funded, all of this is based on whether the legislature funds it. But yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, not hearing any pushback on these roles. If anybody has concerns about, you know, the description of these roles for the state, please speak up and let Kimberly and others know. But it sounds like maybe Kimberly working on just kind of crafting this in a way that you feel like it's capturing the suite, is reflective of the friendly amendment that Oriana just suggested. Do you want help? Do you want me to ask for volunteers to help, or do you want to just go it alone on this one? If anybody's really compelled to work.
I'm fine just drafting. Yeah, I mean, in the wrongly.
Okay.
And or I could just draft and send to a subgroup. I know we're all very tired, so I don't want to create a work group over something that may need a.
Yeah, this could be a pretty simple exercise. Just want to make sure you feel good about the words, and then make sure the group gets a chance to weigh in with the consensus. So we'll put that on as an action item for coming back. And in the 2 minutes we have left, let's just tee up and look forward to the next few weeks. Lily, I'm going to bring you forward for a minute and ask, where's your thinking at, based on the conversation where we've landed today, and it's okay if this isn't a perfect response, but what are you thinking about in terms of version 3 of the draft and how we kind of evolve this and tend to some of the kind of formatting and organizing features that people raised some questions about earlier? We'll set the website part aside for now, just talking about the document and the substance.
Yeah, I think today's conversations have been really helpful in thinking about how we might want to structure the version 3. I'm kind of seeing some major themes emerge, sort of programmatic recommendations. There's recommendations that are sort of overarching that we just spent a lot of time on today, and then some other various recommendations, like if about like funding place-based planning specifically. So I think I'm going to put some thought into those and those themes that have been emerging, and trying to tie things together, because I also heard a lot today about wanting to have a more cohesive document to vote on and to find consensus around. So hopefully I can do all that and get you all a version 3 that that you can work on at the next meeting.
Okay. The question I have is, we have this big piece next time around the recognition of a plan and implementation. We started the discussion last time. It quickly became apparent that, one, not everybody is clear about what the current approach is with recognition of a plan and supporting implementation from the pilots. So there's a lot of, I feel like, foundational information that the department could offer to help ground people in some of these pieces. There was some conversation about a couple of different funds that not everybody is totally clear on, questions about linkages, lines to those funds from place-based planning, and then any of the kind of early learnings that are happening with the place-based pilots as they're transitioning into implementation. So I know Raquel and team are ready to prepare some information on that to better inform that discussion. But it is a really big piece, and hearing people say that it's hard to kind of weigh in on single things without seeing the full picture. I just, with a grain of salt, I think the version 3 that Lily is going to provide for you is really only going to capture everything up through to that piece. And that section is going to be a critical section for us to talk about at the start of the November 1st meeting. So I think just sort of tempering our ability, you know, knowing that we're going to have to kind of look at the whole suite of ideas comprehensively at the November meeting. For some of you to be able to say, I would agree with this concept, but it's tied to this concept. So I just want to acknowledge that we may not have a kind of a perfect order of operations here. We also have not had a chance to revisit the guiding principles writ large for effective water planning. And those were some items that kind of emerged throughout the course of this work group. They showed up as essential elements, they showed up as assumptions, they showed up as guiding principles. And some of you have indicated a desire to revisit those and see if there's a way that you would want to capture those into your report. So Kimberly and there's a small group of folks that actually had put their eyeballs on those. And we want to make some room at the next meeting to look at that. Kate and Kimberly, one of the action items from the last meeting was they were going to work together to maybe craft an intro statement that strikes that balance between that really rich conversation you had at the beginning of the last meeting about the value proposition of place-based planning, and then the right place and role of place-based planning in the system. And they've come up with a kind of a sentence or two that tries to kind of be clear and straightforward about just what is this tool. And so those are two pieces that we'll be bringing forward for the group. It would be really helpful if you could review those items, and we will try to be clearer about specifically what we would ask that you prioritize for your review for the next meeting, so that if it looks too overwhelming, you've at least got a prioritized list of items that we'd really like to have you review in advance of the meeting. Anything else, Lily or Jenna, by way of next steps that I've missed? We didn't have anybody sign up for public comment, by the way.
Robin, I have a quick question. We heard a number of people say they're going to be absent in November, and I just want to confirm that there's avenues for people to get their input in.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and I think that is another item that we've been sort of noodling around with is it best for us to have a full review of version 3 of the document after the November 1st meeting, so that everybody is sort of caught up with some of the discussions that occurred at the November meeting, and just finding ways for everyone to access the dialogue that's going to happen around implementation, recognition of a plan. So we were actively, consciously trying to figure out what are the right channels for people to stay engaged, even if you can't attend the meeting. And it's going to get tight. We have 2 meetings scheduled. We have a meeting in 2 weeks and we have a meeting on December 6th. You know, we're going to have to just do our best to figure out what's the best use of your time, and you'll have to help us figure that out. We can make some guesses, educated guesses, but we're really not driving this. We really wanted to make sure that the issues that are important to you all are the issues that you're focusing on. So I really appreciated the conversation today, because I think we sort of were able to recapture some really big core issues that are important to people that maybe we're feeling like a little bit of a frustration that we weren't picking up and making sure we were being explicit about with some of those foundational items. So again, Jenna or Lily, any follow-up that I missed? Okay.
Yeah, and then I just really quickly add in, for those workgroup members that are able to join the November 1st meeting in person, please, if you haven't yet, get me that RSVP by tomorrow. And today we just kind of need to wrap everything up, kind of responding in kind to workgroup kind of precautions around being in person. Only workgroup members, process leadership, and project team are going to be, in that room for those who are able to be there in person. Members of the public, it'll be a hybrid meeting, and members of the public will be able to tune in and watch as per usual via Zoom. So thanks for getting those over to me, work group members.
Thanks, Jenna. All right, well, we'll let you go. Sorry, we're 5 minutes over. Really appreciate you all, and we'll look forward to catching up with you again in a couple weeks. Thank you.